How does someone go from invisible to unstoppable? Grace's journey isn't just about revenge, it's about identity. When people repeat lies long enough, you begin to believe them, but truth has a way of waiting for the right moment to be heard. In that courtroom, she didn't just fight others, she reclaimed herself. The deeper lesson? Freedom begins the moment you stop believing you are small. Like and share if this made you reflect. Thanks for watching.
On the evening of their 5th anniversary, while 7 months pregnant, Grace received a gift from her husband. It was not jewelry, and it was not a vacation. It was a heavy stack of divorce papers. With them came a check for $10,000 and a simple instruction: be out of his house before sunrise. As a brutal storm raged outside, his mother arrived, holding a celebratory bottle of champagne and a stack of empty packing boxes. She walked straight past Grace and into the baby's nursery, where she began stuffing the tiny, hand-knitted clothes into a large black trash bag. Grace stood there, frozen in disbelief. A few minutes later, another woman showed up. She was stunning in a tight red dress and immediately started measuring the living room windows for new drapes. Grace was given just 1 hour to pack up 5 years of her life. She ended up on the sidewalk in the pouring rain holding a single suitcase, the soggy check, and a small locket she had treasured since childhood. It was the only thing she possessed from her parents, who died in a car crash long ago. Her husband once told her she was as forgettable as elevator music. His mother called her a stray cat they had foolishly let in. They were both convinced she was nobody, had nothing, and would never amount to anything. But inside that little locket was a secret. It was a secret that tied her to a family so powerful, so incredibly wealthy. It made the Crawfords look like small-town players. And when that truth finally came to light in a courtroom, in front of a judge and 5 of the best lawyers in the state, with her billionaire grandfather sitting right behind her, her husband's carefully built world did not just stumble, it completely disintegrated. He was totally and utterly blindsided. The lesson from this story is a powerful one. Your value is never defined by the people who choose to leave you. Your true worth is shown in the life you create for yourself after they are gone. Never let someone else's cruelty become your identity. If this story is already giving you goosebumps, please drop a comment and share which part connected with you. Press the like button so this story finds its way to someone who needs to hear this message. Share it with a friend who could use a reminder of her own strength. And please subscribe if you enjoy stories that are anything but ordinary, because this channel is all about the unexpected. I will see you in the next video. Dylan Crawford did not just want to end his marriage, he wanted to completely erase it from history. He was determined to wipe out every memory of his wife with absolute ruthlessness and zero compassion. He looked across the room at the woman who had washed his shirts, cooked his meals, and was now carrying his child. He saw her as just a poor orphan he had generously saved from a future of waiting tables and surviving on instant noodles. He felt nothing for her, not even a little bit. She had become an annoyance, like an old suit in the back of his closet that he was sick of looking at. But Dylan had made a massive miscalculation. He mistook her quiet nature for a lack of intelligence. He confused her kindness with weakness. He was absolutely sure that a woman with no connections, no money, and no family could never pose a threat to him. He had no idea that when he pushed those divorce papers across the table, he was not just ending a marriage. He was lighting the fuse to a bomb that would blow up his entire world, exposing every secret he kept and every cruel word he had ever spoken. This is the tale of a man who threw away a diamond because he was too focused on a piece of glass. And it is the story of how that diamond, without ever having to shout, brought his whole fake kingdom to the ground. The envelope was thick and made of expensive cream-colored paper, giving it a very official look. It was lying on the mahogany coffee table, right in the spot where a beautiful anniversary bouquet should have been. The date was October the 14th, a Wednesday. It was Grace and Dylan Crawford's 5-year wedding anniversary. Grace stood in the middle of their fancy New York townhouse, her hands still a little wet from washing the dinner dishes. She had prepared Dylan's absolute favorite meal: roast chicken with fresh herbs, creamy garlic mashed potatoes, homemade bread, and a salad with the pricey imported olive oil he insisted on. The dining table behind her was perfectly set for 2 people. It had tall white candles, an emotional anniversary card that took her an hour to write, and resting against a small vase was the ultrasound picture of their daughter. At 28 weeks, the photo showed a perfect little face and 10 tiny fingers. Grace was 32 years old and 7 months along in her pregnancy. She moved slowly and gently, often placing a hand on her growing belly. She was wearing her only nice maternity dress, a simple navy blue piece from Target that cost $30. She had bought it by skipping her own lunch for 2 weeks, telling Dylan she simply was not hungry, while she secretly ate a single granola bar from her purse. Dylan would not have cared if she had been dressed in a potato sack. He had not really seen her in more than a year. She heard his key in the lock at 9:47 that night. He was more than 3 hours late. Her text messages to him had gone unanswered. The roast chicken had started to dry out around 8:30. She had turned the oven off for good at 9 o'clock. The front door swung open and the sound of expensive shoes clicked across the hardwood floors. Dylan Crawford walked in, and with him came a blast of cold October air and the lingering scent of whiskey and a perfume Grace did not own. He was a handsome man, but in the same way a finely crafted knife is handsome, sleek, polished, and capable of causing great harm. He had dark hair, a strong jawline, and a fit body maintained by a personal trainer Grace was not allowed to use. Dylan once joked that she did not need a gym membership when she got so much exercise scrubbing their floors. He did not look at Grace. He did not notice the beautifully set dinner table. He completely ignored the ultrasound picture. He walked directly to the bar, poured a large glass of bourbon, and leaned against the counter. He looked like a man who was about to do an unpleasant but required chore, like taking out the trash or firing an employee. He nodded toward the coffee table with his glass. "So I see you got it." Grace looked at the envelope. She did not have to open it to know what was inside. The warmth in their home had been disappearing for months, perhaps even for years. It disappeared with every late night he spent out, every new password on his phone, and the way he would pull away if she tried to touch his arm, as if her touch was dirty. She picked up the ultrasound photo from the table where the envelope had been tossed right on top of it. She gently smoothed out a small corner that had been bent and held the picture against her heart. "Happy anniversary, Dylan," she said quietly. Her voice was calm and even, like water flowing gently over rocks. It was that very calmness that always drove Dylan crazy, because he could never get a reaction out of her. He could never make her cry or scream, and he hated that he could not break her spirit. Dylan let out a short, nasty laugh. "God, you are so predictable, even now. No drama, no tears, just happy anniversary." He took a big drink of his bourbon. "This right here is exactly why it is over between us, Grace. You have no passion, no fire. You're just kind of here. You are like a piece of furniture. You are the off-white paint on a wall that nobody ever notices." Grace clutched the sonogram photo a little tighter against her chest. "Is that what the divorce papers say? Irreconcilable differences because I am like off-white paint?" "They say whatever my attorneys told them to say," Dylan snapped back. He slammed his glass down on the counter, and a small circle of bourbon splashed onto the polished wood. Grace's eyes immediately darted to the spill. Years of habit made her want to wipe it up. She did not even twitch. "The point is, this is finished. I have moved past you, Grace, and that is the reality. People grow, they change. You were a good choice when I was a junior associate and needed a wife to run the household and stay out of my way. But I am a name partner now. I close deals with men who own estates in the Hamptons. I have lunches with senators and chief executive officers. I need a wife who fits into that world, a woman who can chair a charity auction, a woman who commands attention the second she walks into a room, not someone who looks like she should be serving the appetizers." The insult hung in the silent room like a bad smell. Grace did not even blink. For 5 painful years, his voice had been a constant sound in her life. The words were different each time, but the cruel point was always the same. Dylan served his insults like a daily helping of poison, meant to slowly crush her spirit. He often told her, "You are so fortunate that I even gave you a chance." He would say, "Without me, you would be a total nobody. You do not have a family, you do not have an education, and you do not have a background worth talking about. I am the one who gave you a life. The absolute least you can do is act grateful." Grace put a protective hand on her stomach. "And our daughter?" she asked, feeling a faint movement against her skin. Dylan just waved his hand dismissively, as if he were shooing away an insect. "Your daughter?" "I will pay whatever the judge orders. $800 a month seems about right for a person with your earning potential. And let us be real, you have none. Without me, Grace, you will go right back to waiting tables. That is where you came from." Grace looked at the envelope he had tossed onto the table. "What are the conditions?" she asked. "They are extremely generous," Dylan said, a smug look spreading over his face. It was the kind of look a person gets when they think they are a hero for doing something terrible. "You get $10,000 in cash. Consider it a severance package for 5 years of work. You can take your clothes, that little locket you always wear, and whatever other junk you brought with you. But I need you out of this house tonight." "Tonight?" Grace echoed, her brain struggling to keep up. "Dylan, it is pouring rain. I am 7 months pregnant. And Brittany's interior designers are arriving tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock on the dot. I want every single sign of you erased. I want your scent gone from this house, that cheap soap you buy for your supposed sensitive skin. I want to look in my closet and not see one single tag from a discount store." In that instant, Grace looked at him. She really saw him, the way a person examines something for the final time. She was not memorizing his face because she loved him. She was searing it into her brain so she would never forget the image of pure cruelty. She saw his cheeks, which were red from the expensive liquor he was drinking. She saw his eyes, which were hard and completely empty. And she saw the costly watch on his wrist, the one she had bought him for their 3rd anniversary. She had afforded it by secretly setting aside money from the grocery funds, by eating less herself so that he could have more. "Can I at least stay until the morning?" she asked. Her voice was surprisingly steady. It was not a plea. It was a simple question. "No." At that very moment, the doorbell chimed. Dylan's entire expression changed in a flash. The anger disappeared and a spark of excitement took its place, like a little boy hearing an ice cream truck. He walked to the front door and swung it open. Margaret Crawford was standing on the porch. She was 63 years old, as thin as a stick, and wore a cream-colored cashmere coat like it was a set of armor. Her gray hair was pulled back in a severe, unforgiving bun. Her lips curled into a smile that had all the friendliness of a steel trap. In one hand, she held a bottle of fancy champagne. In her other hand, she carried a stack of flattened cardboard boxes. "Oh, wonderful," Margaret said, brushing past Dylan as if he were simply the help. She did not even look at Grace. She had actually made it a point to never look at Grace since the wedding. That was the day she had whispered to her son, loudly enough for everyone in the first row to hear, that marrying a girl out of the foster system was a huge mistake. She said it was like bringing home a stray animal. At first you feel good about yourself, but then you find pests all over your furniture, and you regret ever opening the door. "She is still here," Margaret said, placing the champagne on the counter with a loud clink. "I brought some boxes. Let us get this over with." "Margaret," Grace started to say. "Do not," Margaret cut her off, finally turning to look at her. She stared at Grace with the kind of look a restaurant inspector would give a filthy stove. "I have waited 5 years for this moment, Grace. 5 long years of seeing my son throw away his life on a woman who has nothing, comes from nothing, and is completely insignificant. So please, spare me the waterworks and begin packing your belongings." Margaret grabbed the cardboard boxes and began walking up the staircase. A cold, heavy feeling of dread started to grow in Grace's stomach as she watched her leave. "Where are you going?" Grace asked, her voice following her up the stairs. "To the nursery," Margaret replied, without looking back. "Brittany has already chosen a new design. We have to get rid of all this second-hand trash." Grace moved as quickly as her pregnant body would let her. She got to the nursery doorway just as Margaret started clearing things from the shelves. This nursery was the only room in the entire house that felt like it belonged to her. It was the one area Dylan let her design, because he had no interest in anything related to a baby. Grace had painted the lovely butterflies on the walls all by herself, using gentle shades of yellow and pink. She had spent many hours balanced on a stepladder with a very small brush. The crib came from a thrift shop. Grace had spent 3 whole weekends sanding it down and painting it a fresh, bright white. She made sure the finish was perfectly smooth so that a splinter would never harm her baby's soft skin. On the shelves were tiny stacks of baby clothes she had purchased one at a time from a charity store. She had washed every single piece twice and folded them with so much care. Margaret grabbed the little pile of clothes. She held them away from herself as if they were infected with some terrible sickness, then dropped them into a large black garbage bag. "Margaret, please," Grace pleaded, her voice finally breaking. "Those are for my baby." Margaret just looked at her, her expression a perfect picture of pure, open disgust. "Brittany will furnish this nursery the right way, with brand new items from expensive shops, not from a resale store. This room is going to be for a real family." Grace had to hold onto the door frame to keep her balance. "What do you mean, a real family?" Margaret's smile was the most wicked thing Grace had ever witnessed. "Oh, did Dylan forget to tell you? Brittany is 2 months pregnant. They are wishing for a boy." "You did not honestly think you were special, did you, Grace? You were just a temporary solution? You were the warm-up wife until he found someone who was actually important?" The words felt like a punch to her stomach. Grace glanced down the hallway and saw that Dylan had shown up. He was just leaning against the wall, scrolling through his phone. "Is it true?" Grace whispered. Dylan did not bother to look up from his screen. "What difference does it make? Just sign the documents, Grace. Take the $10,000 and leave." Grace stood there, frozen in the beautiful nursery she had poured her whole heart into. One hand gripped the doorframe while the other rested on her belly. Inside her, her daughter was kicking, so full of energy and completely ignorant of the harsh world she was about to be born into. She was depending on her mother, a woman who had just been informed she was worthless. The garbage bag near Margaret's feet contained every single item of clothing Grace had been able to gather for her child. She looked at Dylan, who seemed completely uninterested in the entire scene. She looked at Margaret, who was standing there like a conquering queen. And then, something deep within Grace, a part of her that had been stretched to its absolute limit for 5 long years of being quiet, of being thankful, of begging him not to go because she had nowhere else to turn, that part of her did not break. It just became perfectly still and quiet. "I will pack," Grace said. She walked into the bedroom and took her old, worn suitcase from the back of the closet. It was the very same one she had brought with her 5 years before. She packed 3 outfits. She packed the picture of her parents, a blurry, faded photo of a man and a woman she never knew. They were standing in a garden she couldn't identify. She had taken that picture with her through 6 foster homes, 2 group homes, and 1 marriage. It was the only evidence she had that she came from somewhere. It was the one thing she owned that proved she was once loved. She also grabbed a small wooden box meant for jewelry. Inside, a heavy platinum locket sat on the faded velvet. The piece was clearly old and heavy, showing the work of a master craftsman. An image was carved into its surface, but she could never clearly see what it was. It looked like some type of bird, perhaps an eagle, holding something in its claws. On the back, 3 letters were engraved, W to WRB. This locket was the only link she had to the parents she never knew. A woman from social services had given it to her when she was just 6 years old. The woman told her it had been found in the car after the crash that took her parents. Grace had worn it every day since. Dylan had always made fun of it, calling it a cheap trinket. His mother, Margaret, once called it a worthless piece of junk. Grace fastened the locket around her neck, hiding it safely under the collar of her dress. She left all the diamonds Dylan had given her in a small pile on his side of the bed. There was the engagement ring, a tennis bracelet he gave her to say sorry for missing Christmas, and the anniversary earrings he did not even remember buying because his assistant picked them out. With her 1 suitcase in her hand, she walked down the stairs. The living room did not feel like her space anymore. A woman named Brittany Voss had taken it over. She was 28 years old with hair that was a color of blonde you can only get from a bottle and a spray tan that looked like burnt sugar. She had on a red designer dress that probably cost more than everything Grace owned. She was walking back and forth, pointing at the furniture while ordering someone around on her phone. "That couch needs to be replaced," Brittany said into the phone. "And all this gray is just so sad. I want everything in cream and gold. And that dining room table has to go. It smells like—" She stopped talking when she looked up. She saw Grace coming down the stairs with her pregnant belly and her single, worn-out suitcase. Brittany's eyes widened in a fake, over-the-top display of surprise. Then her expression changed to one of disgusting, sugary pity. "Oh goodness, you are absolutely huge," Brittany said, putting her phone down. "But don't you worry at all, sweetie. I will make sure the nursery is done perfectly. I am thinking all white. Very fresh for a new beginning." At that moment, Margaret walked in from the kitchen, holding a bottle of champagne. She popped the cork, and the sound echoed through the townhouse like a gunshot. Grace set her suitcase down at the bottom of the stairs. She looked at the three of them. Dylan was on the sofa, his arms spread out along the back, with one ankle resting on his other knee. He looked like a king sitting on the throne of his small kingdom. Brittany was next to him, leaning against the arm of the sofa like she was some kind of prize. Margaret stood there pouring champagne into glasses, a smug smile on her face. The three of them were celebrating throwing a pregnant woman out of her home. Grace walked to the front door. She stopped for a moment but did not look back at them. She spoke just loud enough for them to hear her. "You are the one who broke the agreement, Dylan, not me. You should remember that." "Just get out," Dylan said. His voice was empty and tired of it all. It was his final command. Grace opened the door and was hit with a blast of cold, hard rain. October in New York City could be unforgiving. The sky was completely black. The streetlights were just blurry glows in the downpour, and the sidewalk was already covered with puddles. Grace stepped out into the storm, dragging her suitcase with one hand and holding her other hand over her growing belly. The door slammed shut right behind her. She heard the loud click of the lock. Then, through the thick wood, she could hear them laughing. Grace stood on the sidewalk as the rain instantly soaked her hair, sticking it to her head. Cold water streamed down her face and her neck. Her $30 maternity dress was now stuck to every part of her body. Her shoes, the only flat pair she had, were already soaked with water. If anyone had been watching from the windows of the townhouses around her, she would have looked exactly like what Dylan, Margaret, and Brittany said she was. She was a woman who had been thrown away, a failed project, a charity case who was no longer useful. She stood there for a long time. Then, she tightened her hand on the handle of her suitcase and started to walk. She did not even try to get a taxi. She knew she couldn't afford it. She walked for 6 long blocks in the heavy rain until she reached Elena Ruiz's apartment building. Elena Ruiz opened her door at 10:15 on a Wednesday night. She found her best friend standing in the hall, looking like she had just been dragged from the East River. Grace was wet from head to toe. Her hair was in dark, dripping strands, and her maternity dress clung to the round curve of her stomach. She was holding a beat-up suitcase. In her other hand, she held a wet check for $10,000. She was not crying. Her eyes were dry, and she seemed to be looking at something far away that Elena could not see. Elena did not ask any questions. She did not say, "Oh my goodness," or "What happened to you," or "Are you all right?" It was clear that she was not all right. The answers to all of those questions were written in the exhausted lines on Grace's face. Elena just guided her friend inside, took the suitcase, led her to the sofa, and wrapped her in every blanket she owned. Then, she made a hot cup of tea, placed the warm cup in Grace's hands, and sat on the floor in front of her. "You can talk when you are ready," Elena said softly. "Or you can say nothing at all. It does not matter. Whatever happened, you are not going back out in that storm tonight." Grace held the cup, letting the warmth slowly creep back into her cold fingers. The baby suddenly gave a strong kick, as if complaining about the cold, and Grace rubbed the spot with her hand. "He had me served with legal papers," Grace said, her voice so quiet it was almost a whisper. "On our anniversary. And I am 7 months pregnant with his child. His mother threw away all the baby clothes. His new girlfriend is already making plans to change the nursery." Elena's face showed about 6 different feelings in just 3 seconds. The last one was a cold, hard anger, the kind of expression a woman has when she is planning something that involves a fire and a very deep hole in the desert. "I am going to kill him," Elena said flatly. "No, you are not," Grace said back. "Fine," Elena said. "Then I am going to kill his mother. Vandalizing his car is pointless. He would just buy a new one tomorrow," Elena said through a clenched jaw. Grace could almost feel the anger coming off her friend in waves. Her husband thought a simple check would make all his problems go away. But Grace was about to find a secret that would turn her whole life upside down, and you are going to want to hear what happens. "What was his insulting offer?" Elena asked. Grace handed her the check. It was for $10,000. The paper felt a little damp and was creased, but the amount was clear. Elena spoke the number slowly, as if she could not believe it. $10,000? She shook her head, her face a mask of disbelief. "For the last 5 years of your life? For making every meal, cleaning that mansion, and hosting his business parties? For managing his life and carrying his child? He offers you $10,000? Grace looked down at the floor, her voice barely audible. "He said it was a generous offer." Elena let out a short, harsh laugh. "He actually had the nerve to call that generous?" The word dripped with contempt. She took a deep breath, trying to control her temper. "Okay, so what is your next move?" "I already filed a response with the court," Grace told her. "The hearing is scheduled for November 20th. That gives me 37 days. "And who is your lawyer?" Elena pressed. Grace did not answer. "Grace, you cannot go into that courtroom by yourself." "I cannot afford a lawyer, Elena. I went to a free legal clinic and they gave me the paperwork. I just filled it out on my own." Elena stared at her friend in complete shock. "You are going up against a partner from a huge Manhattan law firm and you plan to represent yourself? He is going to show up with 3 lawyers from his own office and you know they will not cost him a penny." Elena massaged her forehead, looking completely defeated. "So what exactly is he demanding?" Elena asked. "He wants to keep everything," Grace replied quietly. "He gets the house, he will not pay me any support, and he is only offering $800 a month for our baby. He also wants me to sign away my rights to any of his other money." Grace added, "His lawyers are claiming that I chose to be a housewife and brought no financial value to the marriage." "You chose not to work?" Elena's voice was sharp with astonishment. "He begged you to quit your job. He told you that your full-time career was taking care of him and the house." "I know," Grace said, her voice filled with regret, "but I was not smart enough to get that in writing." A thick silence fell in the tiny apartment. The only sounds were the soft tap of rain on the window and the quiet buzz of the old refrigerator. Elena lived in a small one-bedroom apartment in Queens that you had to walk up to. The kitchen was just a tiny corner of the living room. The bathroom was so small you could wash your hands in the sink while sitting on the toilet. The couch where Grace was sitting had become her bed for now. A sharp metal spring was poking through the worn fabric, and the cushions sank deeply in the center. But it was a safe place. And it was owned by a friend who cared deeply about her. "You can stay here for as long as you need," Elena said gently. "The couch is not much, but I am not so bad to live with." A small smile touched Grace's lips for just a moment. 3 weeks went by. Grace managed to get her old job back at the Olympia Diner on West 46th Street. It was the same diner where she was a waitress when she first met Dylan 6 years earlier. He had stopped in for breakfast on his way to court. He had ordered a black coffee and a blueberry muffin. He then leaned in and told her she had the most stunning eyes he had ever seen. He said they were the color of violets from a fairy tale. Her face turned bright red as she scribbled her phone number on his receipt. She had believed every word he said because no one had ever looked at her that way before. She truly thought that this handsome, successful man saw something special in her. But now she was back behind that same counter, 8 months pregnant. She was wearing a maternity uniform Elena had found for her at a secondhand store. She spent her shifts refilling coffee cups, putting on a brave smile to ignore the constant ache in her lower back. She worked 4 days a week, earning $9.50 an hour before tips. A good day meant she took home around $60. A bad day was closer to $30. But she never said a word of complaint. Her job at the diner was the one part of her life that had always felt simple and fair. The arrangement was supposed to be easy. You put in the hours, you get your wages. But Elena had to stand by and watch her friend endure a terribly unfair battle. Each night, Grace would return from work with painfully swollen ankles and a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. And each night, another thick, menacing envelope from Dylan's attorneys would be there. The letters were getting nastier. The most recent one accused Grace of getting pregnant just to trap Dylan for his wealth. The claim was so vile that Elena had crushed the letter in her hand and yelled words she rarely spoke. "You need to fight him," Elena insisted later that evening. She sat on the floor, looking up at Grace, who was on the couch with her feet propped up on some pillows. "You gave that man 5 years of your life. You made his meals. You scrubbed his floors. You planned his events. You managed his schedule, his clothes, his medicine, and you even dealt with his impossible mother. That has to count for something, Grace." "But none of that is on paper," Grace answered, her voice heavy with fatigue. "The house is in his name, the cars are in his name, every bank account is in his name. It is like I was an invisible person in my own life, Elena. My only purpose was to make his life run perfectly. And I did my job so well that I practically vanished." Her fingers nervously toyed with a small antique locket she was holding. It was a nervous habit. Her thumb would trace the outline of a tiny bird and 3 letters carved into the back. W-R-B. The locket was made of a heavy, unusual metal that never seemed to lose its shine. It was the only possession she had from her parents, 2 people she never had the chance to meet. Her only memory of them was from a single, blurry photograph. Through the years, different social workers had told her pieces of their sad story, but they were always too busy to give much comfort to one more child in their care. The story was tragically common. Her parents died in a bad car accident when she was just 6 months old. With no other relatives, Grace became a child of the state. She was moved from one foster home to another until she turned 18. The locket and the photograph were her only connections to her past. But on a Tuesday evening in early November, a simple accident was about to change everything. Grace was sitting at Elena's small dining table, trying to make her way through another pile of legal papers. As she was filling out a form, she felt the locket's tiny clasp suddenly break. She tried to push it back together with her fingernail, but her hand slipped. The heavy locket dropped from its chain, hit the edge of the table with a soft metallic sound, and fell to the floor. Grace snatched it up immediately, her heart racing as she checked it for damage. It seemed fine, but the fall had done something amazing. A very thin, almost invisible line had appeared along its edge, a seam she had never seen in all the years she had worn it. "Did your necklace just break?" Elena asked, looking over from her phone. "No," Grace replied, her voice just a whisper. I think it can be opened." She carefully pressed her thumbnail into the tiny groove and the locket clicked open. Inside, one side held a miniature photo of the same man and woman from her picture, but this time they were holding a newborn baby. The other side had a message engraved in delicate small letters. "To our Grace Eleanor, the world was dark until you arrived. All our love, R. and M. Bennett." Grace's eyes were glued to the last name, Bennett. Her parents' last name was Bennett. She had lived her whole life as Grace Miller, a name given to her by her first foster family. "Bennett," Grace whispered, as if she were saying the name for the very first time. Elena was already on her feet, walking around the table to see the carving on the locket over Grace's shoulder. Her eyes then went to the initials on the back. "You R.B.," Elena said out loud. "So your father's last name was Bennett. But who in the world could W.R.B. be?" Grace could only move her head from side to side, feeling completely overwhelmed. "Just give me 20 minutes, Elena said, grabbing her laptop. It took her only 12 minutes. Elena typed W.R.B. Bennett into the search engine. The first results showed a jumble of company names and random people. She changed her search, this time including the words Geneva Jeweler. A man in a pawn shop had once told Grace that the style of the carving was very specific, done by a Swiss artist who only worked for a few extremely rich clients. The third link on the results page was an article from a well-known business magazine from over 20 years ago. Elena clicked on it. The headline practically jumped out at her. William Russell Bennett, the private billionaire who lost everything he loved. The article told the incredible story of a man named William Bennett, who was a powerhouse in both technology and real estate. He had built a $14 billion empire from nothing. Starting with just an idea in his garage in 1972, the article described him as a brilliant but extremely private man who was famous for being ruthless in business. He had one child, a son named Robert Michael Bennett, who was married to a woman named Maria. In 1999, Robert and Maria died in a car accident in upstate New York. Their baby daughter, who was only 6 months old, miraculously survived the wreck. First responders cut the baby free from the twisted metal and rushed her to a local hospital. But that is where a terrible mistake happened. The magazine called it a complete breakdown in the system. Because of some lost paperwork and a social services office that was short on staff, the baby girl disappeared. She was swallowed up by the foster care system. Her first foster parents gave her a new name and her true identity as a Bennett was erased. William Bennett then spent the next 25 years of his life and more than $40 million desperately searching for the granddaughter he had lost. He hired entire teams of private detectives. He fought legal battles and personally visited more than 300 different foster homes. He had searched in every city across New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. For all of those years, he never lost hope. The article included pictures. The first was of a man named William Bennett, who had silver hair and a determined expression standing on the steps of a courthouse. The second was a photo of his son, Robert Bennett. When Grace's eyes landed on Robert Bennett's face, the entire kitchen seemed to spin. It was like looking at a male version of her own face. He had her strong jaw, her high cheekbones, and the very same unique violet eyes that Grace saw in her own mirror every day. Her hands started to tremble so much that the letters on the phone screen became a fuzzy blur. "Elena," she whispered. But her friend was already reading further down the page, her jaw hanging open. "Grace, his full name is William Russell Bennett. That is W-R-B. It's the same as the initials on your locket, and he has your eyes. The baby that survived that car crash." Elena finally looked up from the screen and met her friend's wide eyes. "Grace, he is your grandfather." "That is not possible," Grace said, her voice shaking. "The man is a billionaire. I am a waitress crashing on my friend's sofa." "Your parents were Robert and Maria Bennett. R and M Bennett. It is carved into your locket. Grace Eleanor. That must be your full name." Grace just sat there in a state of complete shock. Deep inside, her baby gave a little kick, and then another, like a tiny hand tapping on a door, ready to start a completely new life. "I do not know what to do," she said, her voice filled with disbelief. "I cannot just pick up the phone and call a billionaire and tell him, do you honestly believe he'll think I'm his granddaughter? He's going to call me a liar. He'll think I've lost my mind." Grace reached for her phone. "You are not calling anyone." "Oh yes, I am, Elena." "No. Grace, you need to listen. You are 8 months pregnant. You are sleeping on a sofa with a spring digging into your back. You work double shifts at a diner just to make ends meet with tips. And in 16 days, you have to go to court and face 3 lawyers who want to take everything from you, including your baby. If there is even a 1% chance this man is your family, I am making that call. You can be angry with me later." Elena dialed the public number for the Bennett Foundation and got voicemail. She left a rambling 4-minute message, being careful to mention a platinum locket, violet eyes, a car accident, and the year 1999. She ended by saying, "I swear on my life, this is not a prank." After hanging up, she poured 2 glasses of water, since Grace couldn't have wine, and said, "Okay, now we wait." They did not have to wait long. Precisely 48 hours later, at 7 o'clock in the evening, there was a knock at Elena's apartment door. This was not a friendly rap. It was 3 heavy, measured knocks, the kind of knock from a person whose time costs $500 an hour. Grace opened the door. A man stood in. The hallway? He was tall, with silver hair, wearing a charcoal suit so perfectly tailored it seemed molded to his frame. Two other men in dark business suits stood just behind him. They kept their hands clasped in front, wore earpieces, and had the intense, still presence you only find in professional bodyguards. "My name is Sebastian Cole," the man announced. His voice was crisp and deliberate, honed by 40 years of choosing words as carefully as a surgeon selects a tool. "I am the personal attorney and legal counsel for William Russell Bennett. May I come in?" Grace moved aside to let him enter. Sebastian took 2 steps into Elena's small apartment and stopped suddenly. His eyes were locked on Grace's face. Specifically, he was staring into her eyes. Sebastian Cole had been William Bennett's lawyer for 31 years. He was there the day Robert Bennett was born. He was there when Robert married Maria. He was at the crash scene, standing in the drenching rain as they pulled a wailing baby from the mangled car. He then spent the next 25 years helping William search for that very child. And right now, he was looking directly at that child. She was now a 32-year-old woman, 8 months pregnant, and living in a tiny apartment in Queens. She had dark, tired circles under her eyes and wore a very familiar locket around her neck. For a fleeting moment, Sebastian's famous professional composure shattered. His hand, the same one that had signed 10,000 legal documents without so much as a tremor, began to shake. He blinked several times and cleared his throat. "Miss Miller," he started, his voice a little less steady than before. "We received your friend's message. We conducted a DNA comparison first thing this morning. We used samples from our private records and compared them to the biological material your foster agency provided to us." He paused, taking a deep breath. "You are Grace Eleanor Bennett. You are the biological granddaughter of William Russell Bennett. You are the sole living heir to the entire Bennett family fortune." Grace collapsed onto the couch, not as a choice, but because her legs gave out from under her. Elena gripped the kitchen counter to stay upright. Grace's hand flew to her stomach, and the baby responded with a kick. "I do not want any money," Grace said. The words tumbled out before she could think, before she could be anyone other than her true self. She was a woman who had been alone her whole life, and there was only one thing she desperately wanted. "I just want to know if I have a family." The look in Sebastian's eyes softened. His lawyerly facade melted away, revealing the deeply compassionate man underneath. "You have a grandfather," Sebastian said gently, "who has not gone a single day without looking for you since you were lost. He is actually sitting in the car downstairs right now. He has been there for 20 minutes. He was too afraid to come up himself." "What was he afraid of?" "He was afraid that you would not want to meet him." Grace glanced at Elena. Her best friend was crying silently, tears streaming down her face as she covered her mouth with her hand. Grace looked back at Sebastian. "Please ask him to come up." William Russell Bennett climbed 4 flights of stairs in an old apartment building in Queens. He was breathing heavily when he reached Elena's door. It was not because he was unfit. At 78 years old, he still played tennis 3 times a week. It was because his heart was doing something it had not done in 25 years. It was starting to hope. He had trained himself to give up on hope long ago. Hope was a bitter joke for a man who had already spent a quarter of a century. He felt like he was chasing a ghost. Every lead turned into a dead end. Every DNA test came back negative. Every private investigator returned empty-handed. Each failure chipped away at William's hope until he forgot what it felt like. He managed his company with a firm grip and ran his home on a strict schedule. He protected his heart with the dark belief that he would likely die long before ever finding his granddaughter. And then, Sebastian called. "Sir, we found her." Those 4 simple words shattered the fortress around his heart. William stood in the entrance of Elena's apartment. He was a tall man with broad shoulders, a full head of silver hair, and a strong profile that looked like it belonged on a coin. He wore a navy suit that cost more than a year's rent for this place. He twisted his hands together, trying to keep them from shaking. And then he saw Grace. She was on the sofa, looking so delicate, so tired, and so very pregnant. She had dark hair and a face that stole William's breath. It was his son's face, the strong line of her jaw, the curve of her cheekbones, the quiet strength. But her eyes, oh, those eyes. They were deep and familiar. They were the Bennett eyes. His wife had them. His son had them. And now this woman, This stranger who was no stranger at all, this ghost who was now wonderfully and terrifyingly real, she had them too. William opened his mouth, ready to say something. He had prepared a whole speech in the car. It was formal and proper, just what a billionaire should say when meeting his granddaughter for the first time. He had even practiced it, but at that moment, every single one of those words vanished. So he did the only thing that felt natural. He just opened his arms. Grace slowly got to her feet. Her pregnant belly made it a struggle. For a second, Elena moved to assist her, but then stopped herself. Grace walked across the small room and she was shaking. William was shaking too. The distance between them was only 8 feet, but it was also a gap of 25 long years. Grace walked right into his embrace. William wrapped his arms around her, careful of the baby, and just held her. He was holding his son's little girl. He was holding the baby he last saw being pulled from a wrecked car on a rainy highway. He was holding the girl he had looked for across 6 states and 2 decades, spending $40 million and 1,000 sleepless nights. He did not say anything. He could not. His chin began to tremble, and his eyes welled up with tears. A sound escaped him that he had never made in his life. It was not quite a sob, but it was the sound of an emotion, locked away for 25 years, finally breaking free. Grace was crying now too. She pressed her face into his chest and wept. She had not cried like this since she was a little girl in a foster home, trying to hide her sobs in a pillow so the other children would not hear. She cried for every forgotten birthday. She cried for every school play with no one in the audience for her. She cried for every single night spent in a strange bed in a strange house, whispering, "Please, someone come and find me." Over in the kitchen, Elena was also crying. She made no effort to wipe away the tears that streamed down her face and dripped onto the floor. Sebastian stood in the hallway, his hand on the door frame. He looked at the ceiling like a man trying with all his might not to break down, his jaw tight and his eyes shining with unshed tears. William gently pulled back but kept his hands on Grace's shoulders. He looked at her face as if he were trying to memorize every single detail. "You look just like him," William said, his voice thick with emotion. "You are the very image of my Robert." Grace wiped the tears from her cheeks. "I have a picture," she said. "It is the only thing I have left of them." William's voice was gentle. "I understand, my dear. But you have something much more precious now." His eyes moved down to her swollen belly, and his entire expression changed. The sadness vanished, and the kindness was replaced by something else entirely. It was a look of complete shock and wonder, so powerful it almost seemed painful. "Is that my great-grandchild?" he asked, his voice filled with amazement. Grace could only nod. She took his hand and carefully placed it on the curve of her stomach. As if on cue, the baby delivered a strong kick right into the center of William's palm. It was as though the baby knew this large, warm hand belonged to someone very important. William's tough exterior completely dissolved. This powerful billionaire, who had faced down corporate rivals and government committees, just melted. Tears began to stream down the deep lines of his face. "Hello, little one," he whispered. "I am your great-grandfather. I have been searching for my family for a very, very long time." But then the warmth in his eyes faded. Something much older and more powerful took its place. It was the look of the man, a man who had built a $14 billion empire from the ground up. It was the face of a person who would never allow anyone to hurt the people he loved. "Grace," William said, holding her hands gently. "Sebastian gave me the short version of what happened. But I need you to tell me everything, every last detail." And so, Grace told him her whole story. She told him about Dylan and their 5-year marriage, which was really 5 years of being his personal maid. She explained how he managed all the money, isolated her from her friends, and slowly wore down her confidence. His cruel remarks became so frequent that she stopped recognizing them as abuse and started to believe they were true. She told him about the anniversary dinner that was a lie. She told him about the divorce papers he put on her ultrasound picture, the $10,000, and his demand for her to get out immediately. She was forced into a blinding rainstorm, 7 months pregnant. She described Margaret holding a champagne glass, throwing empty nursery boxes and baby clothes into a garbage bag. She told him about Brittany, wearing a red dress and a smug smile, talking about her next chapter. William listened to every word of her story without a single interruption. His face was like stone. His eyes did not blink. He sat perfectly still in Elena's old armchair, with his hands resting calmly on his knees. He took in every single word she said. He was like dry earth absorbing a lightning strike, silent and complete, knowing a fire was coming. When Grace finished speaking, a deep silence fell over the apartment. William stood up. He methodically buttoned his suit jacket. It was a small, simple move, but Grace knew exactly what it meant. It was a man preparing for war. "Sebastian," William called out. Sebastian appeared in the doorway almost instantly. "Get the team on the phone. I want all of them. I do not care if they are sleeping, on vacation, or in another country. I want to know every single thing about Dylan Crawford. Every business deal, every dollar he has ever made, every lie he has ever told. I want our top financial investigators looking at his company's books by tomorrow morning. I want a background check so thorough that I know what he ate for breakfast on his 10th birthday. And I want to be in that courtroom on November 20th. "It is as good as done, sir." "And as for his company, Crawford and Mercer." William glanced at Grace, then his eyes returned to Sebastian. "Buy it." Sebastian's eyebrow twitched up by maybe a single millimeter. For him, that was the same as falling on the floor in total shock. "The whole company?" "Every last bit of it. Buy the business. Buy the building it sits in. Buy the parking structure underneath it. I want to own the very dirt that man stands on before he dares to enter a courtroom to fight for my granddaughter's child." Sebastian simply gave a nod. He took out his phone and walked into the hallway. Grace could make out his low, rapid voice like a powerful car engine starting up. William turned his gaze back to Grace, and the steel in his eyes seemed to melt away. "Go gather your belongings, my dear. You and your friend will be staying with me. I own a penthouse on Central Park West, and the deed has already been transferred to your name. I've arranged an appointment for you tomorrow with a top doctor who handles high-risk pregnancies. And I have a legal team ready to ensure the man who cast you out into a storm will never have the power to hurt you or your daughter again." Grace glanced over at Elena. Her friend was propped against the kitchen counter, mascara streaked down her face from crying. With her arms folded, she looked like someone who had just seen her best friend's entire world change in a single moment. "I will go find my coat," Elena said. The very next day, Grace had moved into the Bennett penthouse. Her new residence was an incredible penthouse that took up the whole top floor of a building 62 stories above Central Park West. Through massive windows that stretched from floor to ceiling, the lights of Manhattan twinkled below, offering a stunning panorama of the park and the endless city skyline. Grace's private quarters included a bedroom larger than her entire old apartment, a bathroom with heated marble flooring, and a walk-in closet that was completely bare. Her entire wardrobe consisted of just 3 simple outfits and her work uniform. On that first evening, she stood with bare feet on the cool marble floor in the middle of the huge bedroom, just staring at the millions of lights across the city. Somewhere in the city, inside the lovely townhouse she had taken care of for 5 years, Dylan was sleeping beside Brittany. He was probably having dreams about how simple it would be to defeat her in court. He had no idea that the woman he had thrown away had been discovered by a force so great it was beyond anything he could ever imagine. Grace placed her hand on the window. The glass was cool to the touch as the city lights shimmered. "I do not wish to ruin him," she whispered. William, who had been standing quietly in the doorway, paused. He then came to stand next to her, looking at the same amazing view. "I know you do not," he answered softly, "and that is one of the many things that has made me so fond of you already. You have the same kind soul your father possessed." He stopped for a second before speaking again. "But my responsibility is to make certain he can never harm you again. This is not about revenge, Grace. This is about being a grandfather." He gently kissed her on the forehead, and then left her by herself with the sparkling city lights. That night, Grace slept in a bed that was softer than anything she had ever felt. She lay awake for a while, just looking at the high ceiling. The baby was awake too, kicking and rolling inside of her. Grace softly rubbed her belly in slow, soothing circles. "Everything is going to be okay, Lily," she whispered to the silent room. It was the first time she had ever said the name out loud. For months, she had held it inside her heart, too scared to speak it. She was afraid that if she gave her baby a name, the sorrow of losing her would be unbearable if Dylan succeeded in taking her. But Dylan was not going to take anything from her ever again. Everything is going to be okay. The next 19 days unfolded with the precision of a military operation. Sebastian Cole established a command center on the 48th floor of the Bennett Global Tower on Park Avenue. The space was normally a boardroom for high-stakes business deals. It featured a long, gleaming mahogany table, 6 huge screens on the walls, and a coffee machine that was always brewing. Sebastian brought together a team of the finest legal and financial minds that could be hired. He then aimed all of that immense power directly at Dylan Crawford, like pointing a massive weapon. The first objective was to take over Dylan's company, Crawford and Mercer. The acquisition was completed in just 72 hours through a complicated network of shell corporations and private trusts. The entire process was perfectly legal and designed to keep Dylan from finding out until the perfect time. Bennett Capital Partners, a firm controlled by the Bennett Family Trust, bought a 51% share of the company's stock. The other partners received an offer to buy their shares for 30% above the current market price. They eagerly seized the chance, signed the contracts, and promised to keep the deal quiet. Sebastian also made them sign a standard non-disclosure agreement, which made it illegal for them to say anything. Not one of them uttered a peep. The second objective was a thorough examination of the company's financial history. Sebastian hired a group of 6 forensic accountants from a well-known firm famous for finding financial crimes. They were given complete access to every single financial paper at Crawford and Mercer. As the new controlling owner, Bennett Capital had the full legal authority to examine everything. What the accountants uncovered made Sebastian's blood turn to ice. A slow, cold smile then formed on his face. For 3 years, Dylan Crawford had been methodically stealing money from the clients who had put their faith in him. His technique was not clever or complex. It was a basic, greedy smash and grab, founded on the arrogant belief that no one would ever check the details. Dylan had set up a fake business named Crawford Solutions. The only address for the company was a post office box in Delaware. He used this sham business to charge some of his wealthiest clients for consulting services. Every month, Crawford Solutions would create bills for between $40,000 and $60,000 for work that was never done. Dylan naturally was the one to authorize every single payment, and the funds were transferred straight from his clients' accounts. The only person working for Crawford Solutions was a woman named Brittany Voss. She had no college degree and no real qualifications. On her social media, she described herself as a lifestyle influencer. In only 3 years, Dylan had embezzled $2.3 million. This money was used to pay for Brittany's apartment, her fancy car, and all her designer clothes. It funded her weekly spa visits and a lavish vacation to St. Bart's, a getaway Dylan had told Grace was for work. The accountants also found clear evidence of insider trading. Dylan had bought a huge amount of stock in a company named Tech Core Dynamics. He made the purchase just 3 days before one of his clients, Voss Industries, revealed it was merging with Tech Core. The stock value immediately soared, and Dylan earned a fast $420,000 from that one deal. He then cleaned the money using a secret offshore bank account in the Cayman Islands. It was an astonishingly careless crime. The sole reason he was never caught was that nobody ever had a cause to look into his activities. The third part of this disgusting situation involved his mother, Margaret. Sebastian's people learned that Margaret Crawford had paid a private investigator named Curtis Webb. She gave him $15,000 in cash to fabricate a psychiatric report on Grace. This false document claimed that Grace had been a patient at the Greenfield Psychiatric Center in Albany, New York, when she was only 16 years old. The report untruthfully stated she had a severe personality disorder. It went so far as to call her a threat to herself and to other people. Every single word of that report was a complete fabrication. Grace had never once set foot in Albany. Furthermore, the Greenfield Psychiatric Center had closed its doors permanently in 1997, which was 4 years before the date written on the fake report. The doctor who supposedly signed it, a man called Dr. Raymond Foster, had never been a licensed doctor in any state. Curtis Webb had just invented him. So what action did Sebastian take with this mountain of devastating proof? He took no action at all. He did not go to the police. He did not start a lawsuit. He gave Margaret Crawford no clue that he knew. Instead, he meticulously gathered and filed every last piece of evidence. He even got a signed and witnessed confession from Curtis Webb, the private eye, who became extremely cooperative after Sebastian's lawyers explained his two options: help them or face prison time. After gathering everything, Sebastian simply waited. He was banking on Margaret to present the fake report as evidence during the court case. He wanted her to physically place that document into the judge's hands. At that moment, he would lean back and witness her entire life fall apart. Above all else, Sebastian was a man with incredible patience. While these plans were quietly developing behind the scenes, Grace was experiencing a life she had only ever imagined. She woke up every morning feeling safe in a plush, comfortable bed. She ate her breakfast at a table where nobody ever found fault with her cooking. She had weekly visits with Dr. Patricia Weston, one of the most respected obstetricians in all of Manhattan. The doctor closely monitored Grace's blood pressure, checked the baby's healthy growth, and always assured her that her daughter was doing perfectly. The baby was very active and seemed to particularly enjoy kicking her mother's bladder at 3 in the morning. Grace spent her days getting to know William. They would sit and talk for hours at a time. He shared stories about her father. He described Robert's loud, contagious laugh and his passion for old movies. He talked about how terrible he was in the kitchen and how he insisted on fixing things himself, even though he could easily afford to hire someone. He told her about her mother, Maria, who was a gifted cello player with the New York Philharmonic. She had once played a whole concert with a broken finger because she refused to disappoint the audience. Grace drank in these stories like a person finding water after being lost in a desert. She cherished every detail. She replayed the words in her mind each night as she fell asleep. Through William's memories, she was finally building a picture of the parents she never got to know. In return, William simply listened. He listened as Grace told him her own story. She told him about her years moving through the foster care system. She spoke about the good homes, which were managed by kind but exhausted people. She told him about the awful homes, where she learned to sleep with one eye open and hide her few belongings in her shoes so they would not get stolen. She told him about turning 18 and suddenly being completely alone in the world. She described her first small apartment over a laundromat, which she shared with 2 other girls. She talked about bouncing from one waitressing job to the next until she landed at the Olympia Diner where she first met Dylan. "I really thought he loved me," Grace said softly one evening, while they sat in the penthouse library. "No one had ever picked me before. No one had ever looked at me and said, 'You are the one.' When he asked me to marry him, I felt like all my dreams had come true. I thought someone finally saw me for who I was." William was silent for a long while before answering. "He did not see you, Grace. He saw a chance to take something for himself." "That is a very big difference." "I understand that now." "That is good, because what happens in that courtroom will define your future. I need you to understand, not just believe it, but to know in your soul that you deserve every good thing that is coming your way." Grace's hand instinctively went to the locket at her neck. "I am not doing any of this for revenge." "I know. You are doing it for her," he said with a gentle look at her pregnant belly. "And there is no better reason in the entire world." It was the evening of November 19th, just one day before the court date that would change everything. Grace stood by the huge penthouse window, looking down at the city lights that glittered across Central Park like a scattered galaxy. In the kitchen, Elena nervously snacked on popcorn, reviewing the detailed strategy Sebastian had prepared. Sebastian himself had left for the evening at 10 o'clock, much earlier than usual. He joked that he needed his battle sleep. William came to stand beside Grace quietly. "You cannot sleep either?" he asked in a soft voice. "No? What are you thinking about?" Grace leaned her forehead against the cool window pane. I'm just thinking about tomorrow. I wonder what will happen when he sees me. When he finds out who I really am and who we are now. Are you afraid of that moment? No, it just makes me feel sad. She took a long, slow breath. I feel sad that I gave that man 5 years of my life and our daughter, and he never even made an effort to know me. If he had shown me just a little kindness, William, if he had been even a halfway decent husband, he would never have lost me. He could have lived his whole life without ever knowing my real value. He could have had a wife who loved him, a daughter who saw him as a hero, and a family that would always have his back. That is all I ever wanted to give him. William put a comforting hand on her shoulder. And that is far more than a man like him ever deserved. Maybe, she said. And it is what our little girl deserved. She deserved a father who was present. She deserved a family that was complete. She is going to have a family, William said, his voice solid and certain. She already does. Grace nodded slowly. She touched her hand to the cold glass one final time. I am ready. At that exact moment, just 12 blocks away in a fancy townhouse, Dylan Crawford was drinking bourbon and planning his triumph. He was sprawled on a new leather sofa that had replaced the one Grace had picked out. His new girlfriend, a woman named Brittany, was snuggled next to him, scrolling through expensive furniture websites on her phone. He imagined the courtroom scene. He was sure Grace would not even have the nerve to show up. She had no attorney, no funds, and no fight left in her. She never had any fight in her to begin with. He used to think that quality was attractive, the way she just agreed to anything he wanted. Now it was what he despised most about her. His lead lawyer, a senior partner named Marcus Hale, had assured him the hearing was a mere formality. If Grace was a no-show, the judge would have to rule in Dylan's favor. He would get the house, pay a minimal amount in child support, and be rid of her forever dot model. Marcus even told him, if she actually shows up alone without a lawyer, we are still going to get everything we want, but it will be a much more amusing show for us to watch. By Thanksgiving, Dylan promised Brittany, all of this will be a distant memory. You will become the next Mrs. Crawford, you will live in this house, and that waitress will be back serving coffee where she belongs. Brittany simply smiled and showed him a picture of a baby crib that cost $7,000. I want this one, she said, but I want it made of gold. Dylan leaned over and kissed her forehead. You can have anything your heart desires, my love. His phone vibrated with a new message. It was a text from his mother, Margaret. I've sent an extra document to Marcus. It is a psychiatric report that claims she is an unfit mother. The judge will be convinced she is mentally unstable. We can use this to get full custody, Dylan thought. He stared at the words on his screen. Full custody? He had absolutely no interest in raising the child. He had never even wanted the baby in the first place. The baby was an inconvenience, a biological accident that he wished Grace had simply dealt with on her own. But custody was an incredibly effective weapon. If he threatened to take her child away, Grace would give up everything else just to get her back. It was a calculated business tactic, the same kind he often used to crush his competitors. You find their emotional vulnerability, you apply an immense amount of pressure, and you watch your rival fall apart. Dylan sent a one-word reply to his mother. Good. Then he switched off his phone, drank the last of his bourbon, and went to his bed. He slept deeply and peacefully. He dreamed about his victory. He had no clue that 20 blocks to the north, in a penthouse apartment overlooking the same city, an army was getting ready for battle, just waiting for the sun to come up. The date was November 20th. The setting was the Manhattan Family Court. The courthouse was a huge gray concrete structure on Center Street that looked like a massive tombstone. Its exterior walls were darkened with grime from decades of city pollution and acid rain. On the inside, the hallways smelled like a combination of harsh floor cleaner and raw fear. This was a building where people's lives crumbled every single day. Marriages were dissolved, the destinies of children were determined, and fortunes were split and lost. All of it took place in courtrooms with dark wood paneling in front of judges who had witnessed so much human misery they could detect a lie before a person even opened their mouth. Dylan Crawford pulled up at 8:45 in a black Lincoln Town Car. He was wearing his most expensive suit, a dark gray one from Brioni that he had purchased with money he had secretly taken from a client's account, though he would never tell anyone that. His hair was perfectly in place, and his shoes were polished so well they shone like mirrors. He was carrying a leather briefcase that was totally empty because his lawyers held all the important documents. But it helped him look powerful, and looking powerful was essential to Dylan's sense of self. Margaret Crawford was seated beside him in the car. She had on a navy blue suit with pearl earrings and a faint, smug smile. She held a leather folder in her lap. Inside that folder was the fake psychiatric report that she had paid a man named Curtis Webb $15,000 to invent. Now you remember, Margaret instructed, as they got closer to the courthouse, if she actually comes, which I highly doubt, you will let Marcus handle all of the talking. Your only responsibility is to appear like a devoted father. She is not going to be here, Mother. Of course she is not. How could she possibly scrape together enough money for a subway fare? They both let out a small laugh. It was a cold, hollow sound, like two lizards sharing a secret joke. Dylan's team of lawyers was already inside waiting for them. Marcus Hale, his lead attorney, and two younger associates from the law firm Crawford and Mercer were organizing their things at a table. They had a massive stack of papers, several legal notepads, and the relaxed demeanor of men who were absolutely certain they were about to win. Dylan strolled confidently into the courtroom. It seemed smaller than he had pictured. It had wood-covered walls, humming fluorescent lights, and rows of hard wooden benches for observers. The nameplate on the judge's bench identified her as Judge Patricia Holloway. Dylan did not know a lot about her, but Marcus had informed him that she was seasoned, fair, and extremely strict about court procedures. She was not the kind of judge who could be influenced by emotional displays. This was very good news. Dylan settled into his chair. He looked over at the opposing table, the one reserved for the person who was suing him. It was completely empty. He checked his watch. The time was 8:50. The table remained empty. 8:53. Still no one. A warm, wonderful feeling of triumph began to swell in Dylan's chest. She was not going to show up. Grace, the timid, compliant, invisible Grace, had behaved exactly as he had known she would. She had given up. She had accepted his $10,000 and retreated to whatever miserable little life she had come from. Marcus leaned in to whisper to him, "If she is not present by 9 o'clock, I will request an immediate ruling in our favor. The judge will grant us every single thing we have requested." Dylan simply nodded. He sneakily pulled out his phone beneath the table and sent a message to Brittany. She was a no-show. We won. Champagne tonight. Brittany sent back an emoji of a popping champagne bottle and a red heart. Margaret, who was seated in the first row, offered him a tiny, superior smile. She crossed her ankles and folded her hands neatly on her lap. She was already composing the text she would send to her friends from her bridge club. The large clock on the wall now indicated that the time was 8:56. The plaintiff's table was still unoccupied, 8:57, 8:58. And at that very moment, the chaos began. It started just outside the courtroom, with the sounds seeping in from under the heavy wooden doors. There was a disturbance in the hallway, a jumble of serious voices and the static of two-way radios. This was immediately followed by the distinct, synchronized sound of many footsteps, almost as if a military unit was marching in perfect formation. Dylan shot his lawyer, Marcus, a questioning glance. Marcus just frowned. One of the junior lawyers stood up and opened the courtroom door just a little to look outside. Every bit of color drained from his face, and he quickly sat back down, saying nothing. Dylan whispered harshly, "What on earth is happening out there?" The young lawyer had to swallow nervously before he could speak. There is a very large group of people coming this way," he stuttered. In that instant, the courtroom doors were flung open with tremendous force. They were not simply opened. They were pushed open at the same time by two enormous men in expensive dark suits. Both of them wore an earpiece and had the stern face of a highly trained bodyguard. They did not enter the room. They just held the doors open, standing on either side like stone guardians. The very first person to step across the threshold was Sebastian Cole. He had a thick head of silver hair and was dressed in a charcoal suit with a small gold pin from the New York State Bar on his lapel. Can you imagine being kicked out into a storm, 8 months pregnant, by the very person who promised to love and protect you? That was the terrible reality Grace faced just 5 weeks ago when her husband, Dylan, forced her out of their home. He wanted a wife who was quiet, simple, and stayed out of the spotlight. He came very close to breaking her spirit to make her that way. Now, as Dylan sat in the courtroom, he was filled with confidence that he would win. Then, the doors opened and a powerful man entered. He was tall, and he wore a navy suit that was worth more than Dylan's car. His silver hair and authoritative presence made the entire room feel smaller. Dylan had no idea who this man was, but a sudden chill of fear ran through him. What happens next is a lesson that you should never underestimate a person who has been pushed too far. At that exact moment, the courtroom doors opened wide again and Grace walked in. All of the air seemed to rush out of Dylan's chest. For 3 whole seconds, he completely forgot how to breathe. This was not the broken, helpless woman he had thrown out. She was someone he did not recognize at all. Grace was wearing a custom-tailored navy maternity dress that was both powerful and incredibly elegant. Her friend Elena had done a masterful job on her hair, and her skin had that radiant glow only a healthy, late-term pregnancy can bring. She was a vision of confidence, poise, and absolute control. Her violet eyes, the same ones Dylan had ignored for 5 long years, were now sharp and clear, with no hint of forgiveness in them. A platinum locket was nestled at her throat, shining brightly on a new white gold chain that shimmered in the light. Grace moved with a deliberate, confident stride straight down the center of the courtroom. She never glanced to the left or the right, and she made a point not to look at Dylan at all. She proceeded directly to her table and took a seat next to her lawyer, Sebastian. 4 other lawyers were seated in a neat row right behind them. The imposing older gentleman, William Bennett, took a seat in the very first row directly behind Grace. He positioned himself in a way that made it impossible for Dylan not to see him. The silent message was unmistakable. "She belongs with me. You lost your opportunity and now you will have to deal with me." Several rows back, her friend Elena sat, looking anxious but determined, with her hands clasped firmly in her lap. Elena had been Grace's rock from the very start and was committed to seeing this through to the very end. Dylan's mind was racing as he stared at Grace, desperately trying to understand what he was seeing. None of it made any sense. Grace was supposed to be broke. She was supposed to be completely alone, with no one in the world to help her. She was nothing more than a waitress who bought her clothes on clearance and clipped coupons for groceries. There was no way she could afford a single lawyer, let alone an entire legal team. So why was she sitting there with 5 attorneys, her own security detail, and a man who looked like he could purchase the entire courthouse on a whim? His mother Margaret leaned in from her seat and whispered with urgency, "Dylan, who are all these people with her?" Dylan did not respond. He felt as if he could not speak. His eyes were fixed on the briefcase Sebastian had placed on the table. It was embossed with a golden crest on the expensive leather. A hawk with 2 heads, gripping a sword in its claws. It was the very same symbol he had seen on Grace's locket. He had seen that locket 1,000 times, but had always thought it was just some piece of cheap jewelry. It was also the exact same logo from a memo he had gotten from his company's new owners. He had barely glanced at that memo 2 weeks earlier, thinking the new owners were just some anonymous investment group that would leave him alone. A cold, deep sense of dread began to crawl up his spine. In that moment, Grace turned her head just a little. It was just enough for their eyes to connect for the first time since that awful night she fled their home in a rainstorm. Her face showed no anger. There was not even a ghost of a smile. Her eyes were completely clear of tears. She simply looked at him, the way a person might look at a stranger passing on the sidewalk. The chapter of her life was over, a story that had already been told. She then turned her attention back to the judge's bench. Dylan Crawford sat at his table, experiencing a feeling he had never known in his entire life. He felt utterly small and insignificant. At precisely 9:03 in the morning, Judge Patricia Holloway entered the courtroom. She was a woman in her early 60s, with short gray hair and a pair of reading glasses that hung from a chain on her neck. Her face said that she had heard every possible excuse and was not interested in hearing another. She sat down, straightened her papers, and looked around the room. Her eyes rested for a moment on the plaintiff's side, taking in the 5 lawyers, the security team, and the silver-haired man who carried himself like he owned the building. Her gaze then moved to the defendant's side. She saw 3 lawyers from the defendant's firm, the defendant himself, and an older woman in pearls who looked like she had just smelled something terrible. "We are here today for the case of Crawford versus Crawford," the judge announced in a strong, steady voice. "The purpose of this hearing is the dissolution of the marriage, a ruling on child custody, and the division of marital property. Counsel will now state their names for the court record." Marcus Hale rose to his feet. Marcus Hale, from Crawford and Mercer, representing the respondent, Dylan Crawford. Then, Sebastian Cole stood. He calmly fastened the button on his suit jacket. Sebastian Cole, from the Bennett Law Group, representing the petitioner, Grace Eleanor Bennett Crawford. Marcus blinked, and a look of pure confusion spread across his face. "Bennett?" Sebastian ignored him and continued. "The petitioner's name at birth is Grace Eleanor Bennett. She was separated from her family when she was an infant and was raised in the foster care system under the name Grace Miller. Her true identity has been confirmed by a DNA test. She is the sole living granddaughter of William Russell Bennett." A deep quiet settled over the courtroom. Marcus turned his head very, very slowly to look directly at Dylan. Dylan's knuckles were as white as chalk from his grip on the polished table's edge. His face was just as pale, completely drained of color as if he had just seen a ghost. Judge Holloway looked over the top of her reading glasses at Sebastian. "Mr. Cole, is that William Bennett I see in the gallery?" Sebastian answered with a calm voice, "Yes, Your Honor, it is." The judge processed this new information with the quiet poise of a person who had seen everything. She had handled cases with celebrities, politicians, and even mafia figures. She turned her attention back to Dylan's lawyer. "You may present your opening statement, Mr. Hale." Marcus Hale stood up once more. He had an entire speech prepared. It was all about how Dylan was the sole breadwinner, the dedicated and hard-working husband. It described Grace as a woman who had never worked and claimed that Dylan was entitled to all their assets. He had even practiced it in front of a mirror, and it had sounded quite powerful. He had come here expecting to see Grace sitting by herself, afraid and without representation. But now, looking at the formidable legal team across the aisle, his carefully crafted words felt like a pile of dry leaves waiting for a match. Still, he was a professional. He cleared his throat and started to speak. "Your Honor, my client, Dylan Crawford, is a senior partner at one of the top law firms in Manhattan. He was the only person providing an income for his family. Mrs. Crawford, who now prefers the name Mrs. Bennett, was not employed. She did not contribute any assets to the marriage, and she did not earn any money during the marriage. We are asking for the house, minimum child support, and absolutely no spousal support." He sat back down, looking quite pleased with himself. Next, Sebastian stood up. He carried himself with a calm and self-assured presence. He adjusted the cuffs of his shirt and looked straight at the judge. "Your Honor, before we proceed with the standard arguments, I have several exhibits to introduce. These documents will fundamentally change the perspective of this entire case. They provide details about my client's financial activities, his mistreatment of the petitioner, and the suitability of his home as an environment for their child." The judge gave a simple nod. "You may proceed, Mr. Cole." Sebastian opened his briefcase. The first item he removed was a thick binder, organized with numerous colored tabs. He gave one copy to the judge, another to Marcus, and a third to the court clerk. "This is a complete financial audit of the law firm Crawford and Mercer. It focuses on the accounts Dylan Crawford personally managed for the past 3 years. This audit was requested by the firm's new majority shareholder, Bennett Capital Partners, which acquired a controlling interest in the company on November 1st of this year." Marcus jumped up from his seat. "Objection! We were not informed that the firm had been sold." Sebastian's voice remained even. "It was a private transaction. All parties signed non-disclosure agreements until the acquisition was complete. Your own partners gave their approval." Those financial records are now the property of Bennett Capital Partners. They have every legal right to examine them. Judge Holloway looked at Marcus. Your objection is overruled. Please continue, Mr. Cole. Sebastian glanced down at his notes. He spoke in a clear voice that resonated throughout the room. Every word seemed to land with immense force. For the last 3 years, Mr. Crawford has operated a fraudulent shell company called Crawford Solutions. It was registered to nothing more than a post office box in Delaware. This fake entity billed many of Mr. Crawford's wealthiest clients. Each month, these clients were charged between $40,000 and $60,000 for consulting work that was never performed. Mr. Crawford personally authorized every single one of these payments, using funds that belonged to his clients. Dylan shot up from his chair. That information is confidential company property. Sit down, Mr. Crawford, the judge ordered with a sharp voice. You'll have a chance to speak later. Dylan collapsed back into his seat, the color draining from his face. Sebastian simply continued as if he had not been interrupted. The only person working at Crawford Solutions is a woman named Brittany Voss. She does not have a college degree or any professional training. Her job title is, and I am quoting this, a lifestyle influencer. He let that phrase sink into the quiet courtroom. Over 3 years, Mr. Crawford stole about $2.3 million from his clients using this scheme. He used that money to pay for Miss Voss's apartment, her car, her expensive clothes, and all of her bills. He even paid for a trip to the Caribbean. It is important to know he told his pregnant wife this was a business trip. Sebastian put down the first paper and picked up a second one. We also found out that Mr. Crawford bought stock in a company called Tech Core Dynamics. He bought it just 3 days before one of his own clients, Voss Industries, announced they were merging with Tech Core. The stock's value tripled overnight. From that single illegal trade, Mr. Crawford made a profit of $420,000. He placed the second document on the table. So let me be very clear, Your Honor. While his wife was 8 months pregnant and working as a waitress with holes in her shoes just to afford food, her husband was stealing millions. He was spending it on his mistress and on illegal stock trades. We feel this says everything about his character and is central to this case. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the clock ticking on the wall. Judge Holloway slowly turned to look at Dylan. Mr. Crawford, is there anything you would like to say? Dylan's mouth opened, but no words came out. His lawyer, Marcus, grabbed his arm and whispered to him, but Dylan just shook his head, looking completely defeated. We have nothing to say at this moment, Your Honor, Marcus said, his earlier confidence completely gone. But Sebastian was not done. I have one more thing, Your Honor. He looked over at the audience. Margaret Crawford was sitting in the first row, her face frozen like a statue. Her knuckles were white from clenching her purse. The respondent's mother, Margaret Crawford, has a document she planned to use as evidence. I am asking that she present it now. Marcus froze and looked at Margaret. She gave a small, sharp nod. With a heavy sigh, Marcus took a psychiatric report from his briefcase. Your Honor, Marcus started, we would like to submit a psychiatric evaluation of the petitioner. It was from her time in foster care. It brings up serious doubts about her ability to be a mother. He handed the report to the judge. Judge Holloway read it, then looked up. Mr. Cole, what is your response? Sebastian stood up straight, his hands behind his back. This was the moment he was waiting for. Your Honor, that document is a complete forgery. Margaret shot up in her chair. That is a lie. The doctor on that report, a Dr. Raymond Foster, does not exist. There is no doctor with that license in New York or any other state. The center mentioned, the Greenfield Psychiatric Center, was shut down for good in 1997. That is 4 years before the date written on this fake document. Sebastian brought out another folder. We also have a signed confession from the man who made this fake report. His name is Curtis Webb, a private investigator. Margaret Crawford hired him and paid him $15,000 in cash to create it. Mr. Webb confessed to everything in a sworn statement. He explained Mrs. Crawford's instructions, the cash payment, and how he made up the name Dr. Foster. He gave us this information as part of a plea deal. Sebastian placed the confession directly on the judge's bench. Margaret leaped to her feet, her face as pale as a ghost. He is lying. I never. Dylan, tell them. Tell them it is not true. Ma'am, you need to sit down right now, Judge Holloway's voice echoed through the courtroom. But Margaret paid no attention. She stared at Dylan, her eyes wide with panic. Dylan, do something. You must defend me. Dylan would not even look at her. He just stared down at the table, his hands starting to shake. Bailiff, the judge ordered. 2 officers began walking toward Margaret. The judge spoke again. Mrs. Crawford, you are being removed from my courtroom. I am sending this case to the district attorney to investigate fraud and perjury. You need to get a lawyer. Margaret's jaw dropped. The bailiffs took her by the arms. As they walked her out, she twisted around to look at Dylan. Dylan! You cannot let them do this to me. Everything I have ever done, I did it for you. It was all for you. Dylan sat perfectly still in his chair. He did not look up. He just sat there as his mother's desperate cries faded away and the heavy courtroom doors shut. A thick silence filled the room. Then, Sebastian delivered the final, crushing blow. Your Honor, there is one last thing. We have Mrs. Rachel Torres here in the courtroom today. She is from the New York State Bar Association's Office of Attorney Ethics. Because of the evidence of embezzlement, insider trading, and stealing from clients, the bar is starting the process to revoke Dylan Crawford's license to practice law. In fact, his law license for New York was officially suspended at 8 o'clock this morning. Marcus Hale stood up. He straightened his tie and gave Dylan a look that was both sympathetic and distant. Your Honor, Marcus said, we are withdrawing as counsel for the respondent, starting immediately. Our firm's new owners have told us that representing Mr. Crawford would be a conflict of interest. He packed up his papers. The other 2 lawyers packed up theirs. They all walked right out of the courtroom without even looking back at Dylan. Dylan was left completely alone at the defendant's table. He had lost his lawyers, his mother, his company, and his entire career. Judge Holloway looked at him for a long, silent moment before turning to Grace. Mrs. Crawford, would you like to say anything? Grace slowly stood up. She placed her hands on the table for support, her belly round with her 8-month pregnancy. She decided not to go to the podium. She stayed right where she was, her hands resting over her baby. She never once looked at Dylan. Your Honor, Grace said, her voice calm but powerful. It was not loud or angry, but it had the strength of someone who knows they are right. 5 years ago, I married a man who I thought loved me. I believed him because I had never known what love felt like. I grew up in foster care. I had no family, no money, and no famous last name. When Dylan asked me to marry him, I felt like someone finally saw me for who I was. I thought being loved meant I had to be grateful for it. I used to think that love meant you had to stay quiet while someone took away every part of you, piece by piece, and then you were supposed to say thank you. She paused and took a deep breath. 5 weeks ago, on our anniversary, my husband gave me divorce papers. I was 7 months pregnant. He told me I was nothing but background noise in his life. He offered me $10,000 and told me to get out of our house that same night. While a storm was happening outside, his mother showed up, claiming she was there to help. She went straight to the nursery, a room I had spent months getting ready for our daughter. Then, as I stood there in disbelief, she began stuffing my unborn baby's tiny clothes into a black trash bag. In the courtroom, Grace's voice was steady and clear. It was the only solid thing in a world that had completely fallen apart. I did not know my own identity back then. Just 3 weeks ago, I found out my birth parents were Robert and Maria Bennett. I learned that my grandfather is William Bennett. She gently held the small locket around her neck. This is the only thing I have from them. It was the only thing found after the accident that took their lives. But I need to be clear, Your Honor. The money does not change what he did to me. It does not matter if I am Grace Miller, a waitress, or Grace Bennett, a wealthy heiress. No woman, no pregnant woman, no person on this earth should ever be thrown out into a storm by the very person who promised to love and protect them. The money did not change the truth. It only gave the truth a chance to finally be heard. As Grace returned to her seat, a deep silence fell over the courtroom. After a moment, a voice from the back broke the quiet. It was Elena whispering just loud enough for everyone to hear, "That is my girl." No one in the room tried to quiet her because every single person felt the exact same way. Judge Patricia Holloway did not give her verdict right away. She went back to her private office for 45 very long minutes. During that time, Dylan Crawford sat all by himself at the defendant's table. Some might have thought he was feeling deep regret. In truth, he was watching the world he had so carefully created fall apart and turn to dust. His entire life was founded on one big idea. He was the provider. He was the hero. He was the great man who had saved a nobody and given her a life she could only dream of. Every cruel word, every time he ignored her, every night he came home smelling like another woman. He justified it all with that one big lie. He was the one with all the power. She was the one who was supposed to be grateful. But inside that courtroom, he had no lawyers, no job, no company, and no mother to stand up for him. And the woman he had ordered to be grateful was now on the other side of the room, backed by a legal team so powerful they could probably run a small country. She also had a grandfather whose wealth made the economies of several small countries seem tiny. Dylan could only look down at the shiny wooden table, his finger tracing the lines in the wood. He thought about the night he kicked her out. He recalled the cold rain, her packed suitcase, and the curve of her pregnant belly. He remembered how she stopped in the doorway and said, "You are the one who broke our agreement, not me." He had no clue what she meant back then, but he understood it perfectly now. Their agreement was about so much more than a piece of paper. It was about the simple, unspoken promise between two people. It is a promise that when someone puts their entire life in your hands, you do not crush it and throw it away like garbage. When the judge came back into the courtroom, she sat down and put on her reading glasses. She looked at Grace first, then her eyes settled on Dylan. "I have looked at all the evidence shown here today. This includes the financial records, the false psychiatric report, and what both of you have said. I am now prepared to make my decisions." She held up a stack of papers. First, concerning the custody of the baby. "I am giving full legal and physical custody to the mother, Grace Eleanor Bennett Crawford. The father, Dylan Crawford, will only be allowed to visit with a supervisor present. This is only after he successfully completes a parenting class that this court approves of. He was also ordered to get a psychological evaluation from a licensed professional, which he would have to pay for himself. The judge was very clear that he would not be permitted to see his child until both of these things were done." Dylan squeezed his eyes shut. Next, the judge talked about their home. The townhouse at 447 East 73rd Street was given to Grace. The court recognized her major contributions that were not about money during the marriage. These duties included managing the household, cooking all the meals, planning parties, and looking after the property. Dylan's financial misdeeds meant he lost any claim he might have had to the house. Then came the topic of their money. The judge ordered that Dylan's personal bank accounts and everything in them were to be frozen immediately. The judge had reviewed everything. She saw the financial documents, the dishonest psychiatric evaluation, and listened to all the testimony. Now it was time for her judgment. She lifted a stack of documents. First, she addressed the custody of the child. The court granted full legal and physical custody to the mother, Grace Eleanor Bennett Crawford. The father, Dylan Crawford, would only be permitted supervised visits. He could not see his child until he completed a court-approved parenting course. He was also commanded to get a psychological assessment from a licensed expert, a cost he would bear alone. The judge was firm that until he met both requirements, he would have no contact with the baby. Dylan pressed his eyes tightly closed. Then the judge moved on to their residence. The townhouse at 447 East 73rd Street was given to Grace. The court recognized her substantial non-monetary efforts throughout the marriage. These responsibilities covered managing the home, preparing all meals, organizing social functions, and maintaining the property. Dylan's illegal financial activities erased any claim he could have had on the house. After that, she dealt with their assets. The judge mandated that Dylan's private bank accounts and all related funds were to be frozen immediately. With her hands resting on her stomach, she felt the soft kicks of her daughter inside. The quiet of the courtroom surrounded her like a warm blanket. Sebastian reached over and put a comforting hand on her shoulder. "It is all finished now," he whispered. William was already standing up. He walked through the short gate and stood right behind Grace's chair, his hand resting firmly on her shoulder as a sign of support. Grace finally stood up. As she turned to go, her eyes met Dylan's for the very first time that day. He sat all alone, his hands flat on the table in front of him, his head down. He looked so much smaller than she remembered. He was no longer a powerful lawyer in an expensive suit or the owner of a beautiful home. He was just a man at a table who had lost everything. Grace did not feel any sense of victory. There was no joy. Instead, a deep and empty sadness came over her. It was the kind of sadness you feel when you realize something you thought you had lost was never really yours at all. She said nothing to him. There was nothing left to say. She turned and walked to the courtroom exit. William held the large door open for her while Sebastian stayed close by her side. Their team of 4 lawyers followed right behind them. Elena was waiting for them in the hallway. The second she saw Grace's face, her eyes filled with tears, which she tried to hide with a cough that did not fool anyone. "Are you okay?" Elena asked, taking both of Grace's hands into her own. "I am okay. You were amazing in there." "I just told the truth, that is all." "Well, the truth looks wonderful on you today." They walked out of the courthouse together. The November air was chilly and crisp. It was raining, of course. It seemed like the sky knew the moment needed a little bit of drama, even if Dylan Crawford did not. Grace paused at the top of the wide courthouse steps. She looked out at the rain, the same kind of heavy rain that had soaked her just 5 weeks ago. On that day, she had stood on an empty sidewalk with only one suitcase, a check for $10,000, and the awful feeling of being completely worthless. She pulled the collar of her warm coat up around her neck. William opened a large black umbrella and held it over her head to protect her. "Are you ready to go home?" he asked her softly. Grace looked up at him. She glanced at Elena, who was trying to share a tiny umbrella with Sebastian, which he did not seem to be enjoying. She looked out at the huge, gray, rain-covered city, and she knew it all belonged to her now. With a slight smile, Grace simply said, "Yes, I am ready." After she left, Dylan Crawford stayed in the empty courtroom for a very long time. An officer approached him twice to say the room was needed for another case. Both times, Dylan seemed completely unaware of the officer's presence. Finally, he got to his feet very slowly. He fastened the button on his suit jacket from pure habit, like an old soldier who still salutes long after a war is over. He picked up the leather briefcase that once made him feel powerful and walked out of the room. He stood on the courthouse steps just as the rain started to pour, soaking his expensive suit. There was no umbrella. There was no driver waiting for him. He had no one to call because no one was left. He just stood there in the heavy rain on the steps of the building where his entire world had been dismantled. He was a perfect reflection of Grace from 5 weeks before, invisible, forgotten, and completely alone. Eventually, he started walking. In the 7 days that came next, Dylan Crawford's life wasn't just ruined. It was taken apart piece by piece like a demolition crew that knows exactly where to strike to make a building collapse. Eventually, he started walking. In the 7 days that came next, Dylan Crawford's life wasn't just ruined. It was taken apart piece by piece like a demolition crew that knows exactly where to strike to make a building collapse. Brittany was the first domino to fall. She was waiting at the townhouse when he got back from court, but not in the way he expected. She was not lounging on the sofa in a $1,000 dress, scrolling through her phone. Instead, she stood in the entrance hall, surrounded by a small mountain of designer suitcases. She wore oversized sunglasses even though it was 6:30 at night and a storm was raging. This was Brittany's classic way of saying, "I have been crying, but you will not see my ruined makeup." "What is all this?" Dylan asked, though he already knew the answer. Brittany took off the sunglasses. Her eyes were red and swollen, but not with sadness. They burned with pure anger. "Daddy called me the second the hearing ended. His legal team explained the whole audit to him. Do you have any idea what he called you, Dylan? He called you poison. He said that anyone connected to you is about to be pulled into a massive federal investigation. He's yanking the Voss Industries account from your firm." "He cannot just take the account," Dylan started to say, But Brittany cut him off. The firm is not yours anymore, Dylan. His family owns it. Did you pay attention to anything that happened in court today? He's yanking the Voss Industries account from your firm. He cannot just take the account, Dylan started to say, but Brittany cut him off. The firm is not yours anymore, Dylan. His family owns it. Did you pay attention to anything that happened in court today? Dylan's briefcase slipped from his hand and hit the floor with a dull thud. Brittany, this is only a temporary problem. I know how to fix this. I have gotten out of tougher situations before. Brittany just looked at him like he was a flashing red light on her car's dashboard. A light that had been blinking for months, and now smoke was finally pouring out from under the hood. You cannot fix this, Dylan. You do not even understand what this is. Your license to practice law is gone. Your firm is gone. Your clients are gone. Your mother is about to face charges for lying under oath, and now my father is getting ready to sue you just to save his own reputation. She pulled the last zipper on her suitcase closed. The sound was sharp and final. I am not sinking with this ship. What about us? He pleaded. What about our baby? You told me that you were... Brittany's expression suddenly went cold and empty. There is no baby, Dylan. There was never a baby. Your mother made up that story to hurt your wife, and I played along because I figured it was a harmless little lie. She grabbed her luggage. I'm going to Miami. Dad has a condo there. Do not even think about calling me. Brittany, please wait. I did all of this for you. I left my wife for you. I built this whole company for you. Your mother made up that story to hurt your wife, and I played along because I figured it was a harmless little lie. She grabbed her luggage. I'm going to Miami. Dad has a condo there. Do not even think about calling me. Brittany, please wait. I did all of this for you. I left my wife for you. I built this whole company for you. Brittany stopped in the doorway. She turned back and gave him a look so cold it cut right through her spray tan and designer labels, showing a chill that was far older than her 28 years. You did not do any of this for me, Dylan. You did every bit of it for yourself. You wanted a trophy wife, and I was happy to play the part while you were paying my bills. But I do not date broke men. That was a job for your ex-wife. Why don't you go see if she wants you back? She paused for a moment. Oh, that is right. She is a billionaire now. Good luck with that. The front door clicked shut behind her. The sound echoed in the empty house. 2 days after that, the story broke in the Financial Times. The headline was absolutely crushing. Crawford and Mercer fraud scandal. Partner stole millions while his pregnant wife lived in poverty. The article was long, filled with details, and completely destroyed his name. It described the audit's findings, the fake corporation, the illegal stock trades, the phony psychiatric report, and the awful detail that Grace had worked as a waitress while 8 months pregnant, all while Dylan was sending millions to his mistress. The Wall Street Journal published a nearly identical article the same morning. By noon, the New York Post had the story, and by 3 in the afternoon, it was a top trending story across the entire country. Dylan lost 300 connections on his LinkedIn profile in just 24 hours. His phone, one of his few remaining possessions, buzzed constantly with texts from old colleagues. None of them offered to help. Most messages said the same thing: do not contact me again. Their lawyers told them to keep their distance. 2 of the messages were just a single word: wow. Within 48 hours of the hearing, Crawford and Mercer officially lost the Voss Industries account. Richard Voss, a man who became a billionaire by always knowing which way the wind was blowing, issued a public statement. He announced his complete support for Grace Bennett's new charity and even promised a $5 million donation. He never mentioned his daughter. And he never mentioned Dylan. 5 days after the hearing, Margaret was arrested. 2 detectives from the district attorney's fraud division came to the townhouse where she was staying. Dylan had given her a key a week before the trial. They arrested her for fraud, for submitting false court documents, and for plotting to take away a mother's rights using lies. Margaret called Dylan from the police station. He was sitting in the townhouse kitchen, which was now almost completely bare. Grace had been awarded the house, and Brittany had taken almost every single piece of furniture. When his mother called, her voice was a weak whisper that he had never heard before. "I need a lawyer," she said. He answered, "I do not have any money for a lawyer, Mom." She argued back, "Well, you need to get some. Sell something. Borrow it from someone. There is no one left to borrow from, he said, his voice completely flat. There was a long, heavy pause on the phone. I did all of this for you, Margaret finally whispered, her voice starting to break. Everything I have ever done was for you. I know, Mom. Then you have to help me. Dylan just looked around the empty kitchen. He saw the bare walls where Grace's beautiful paintings used to hang. Brittany's decorators had removed them, and then Brittany had taken all the new art with her. His gaze fell on the broken coffee maker. None of them, not him, not Brittany, not his mother, had ever bothered to learn how to fix things. Fixing things was always Grace's job. I cannot help you, Mom, he said, his voice barely audible. I cannot even help myself. He ended the call. He could hear Margaret screaming his name as the line went dead. 3 days later, an official notice from the court was delivered. It stated that he had 30 days to vacate the townhouse. The property now legally belonged to Grace. He put his few remaining belongings in a gym bag, the same type of bag Grace had been carrying when she left him. He moved into a tiny studio apartment in the Bronx. The building had no elevator. His apartment had one window that looked out at a fire escape and a brick wall. He slept on a mattress on the floor. The old refrigerator hummed so loudly it drowned out the sound of the city. On his first night there, he just sat on the mattress and looked at the ceiling. He tried to list everything he had lost, but there was too much to count. He lost his firm, his house, and his car. He lost his money, his career, and his reputation. He lost his wife, his girlfriend, and now he had probably lost his mother too. At the beginning of October, he was a senior partner at a major law firm. He had a beautiful girlfriend, a $3 million home, and he truly believed he was the most important person on earth. Now, as November was ending, he was in a tiny apartment with just a gym bag and a cup of instant noodles. He tried to call Grace, but her old phone number was disconnected. He wrote her a letter and sent it to the Bennett Global building on Park Avenue. It came back to him, unopened. A message was written on the envelope in handwriting he did not know. Return to sender. So he decided to go to the building in person. He went through the huge glass revolving doors into a lobby that was bright with marble and steel. He walked to the security desk. I'm here to see Grace Crawford, he said, then quickly corrected himself. I mean, Grace Bennett. The security guard looked down at his computer. And what is your name? Dylan Crawford. The guard typed for a moment, his face showing no emotion. I'm sorry, sir. Your name is on the list of people who are not allowed inside. I cannot let you pass. But she is my wife, Dylan pleaded. Our records show she is your former wife, and you are on the restricted list. Sir, please move away from the desk. Dylan just stood there in the middle of the Bennett Global building's lobby and looked up. The open area was enormous, rising 40 stories high, like a giant church made of glass and light. It was all built by a man who had turned a simple idea for a garage part into a global company. Somewhere high above him on a floor he would never get to see was his ex-wife. He used to believe she was insignificant, but now everything his eyes could see belonged to her. He turned his back and stepped outside, where the freezing winter air felt like a sharp slap across his face. He clutched his jacket tighter around himself. It was the same costly Brioni jacket from the courtroom, the very last thing of value he had left. The jacket still looked good, but it no longer felt like a protective shield. Instead, it was more like a costume from a show that had ended a very long time ago. He started walking south, with no real destination in mind. And then on December 15th, at 2:17 in the morning, Grace's new life truly began. Grace woke up inside the vast Bennett penthouse. A sudden, piercing pain in her lower back and a damp feeling in the bed told her that the time had come. She called out for Elena, who was sleeping in the guest room just across the hall. Within 3 seconds, Elena was standing in the doorway. She was already fully dressed, wearing running shoes and clutching a set of car keys. For the last week, she had been sleeping in her clothes, preparing for this exact moment. Is it time? Elena asked, her eyes shining with excitement. It is time, Grace confirmed. Okay, Elena said, taking control. I have the hospital bag. The car is downstairs. William is going to meet us there. Sebastian has the birth certificate paperwork. I phoned the doctor 20 minutes ago. Grace could only look at her in confusion. "But I just woke up now. How could you have called the doctor 20 minutes ago?" Elena offered a little shrug. "I just had a feeling." They rushed to Mount Sinai Hospital in a car from the Bennett family. Elena was behind the wheel, while Grace sat in the back, breathing deeply and slowly as the contractions came. At first they were 7 minutes apart, but then they shortened to every 5 minutes, and finally every 3. By the moment they pulled up to the emergency room doors, the pains were coming one right after another. William arrived 12 minutes after them. He had been awake, which was how he spent most nights since Grace had moved in with him. He had been sitting in his library, reading a book while he simply waited for this very call. He strode into the hospital wearing a formal suit because William Bennett had not put on casual clothing since 1986. He settled into a chair in the waiting room like a general about to command a major battle. Sebastian showed up 20 minutes later. He was holding a leather portfolio with legal papers and, to the surprise of everyone, a stuffed elephant he had just purchased from the hospital gift shop. It was the most ordinary human thing any of them had ever seen him do. The labor continued for 6 long hours. Grace was incredibly brave, fiercely determined, and used some very creative language, a skill Elena was quite proud to have taught her. At 3:47 in the morning, Lily Grace Bennett was born. She weighed 7 pounds and 2 ounces. She had 10 flawless fingers, 10 flawless toes, and a beautiful full head of dark hair. When she opened her eyes for the very first time, blinking against the harsh hospital lights, the doctor took a small step back. "Well now," Dr. Weston said with a gentle smile, "it looks like she has your eyes." They were a stunning deep violet color that was impossible to mistake. They were the famous Bennett eyes, a trait that had been passed down for 3 generations. Grace cradled her daughter in her arms. She stared at the tiny face and the small hands that were already wrapped around her finger. Weeks later, in a peaceful hospital room, Grace held her newborn baby close. The infant's tiny hand gripped her finger with an amazing amount of strength. This small person, so warm and real in her arms, was the entire reason she had made it through. Her daughter's little kicks had been a constant reminder of hope through all the insults and the long, sleepless nights. "Hello, Lily," Grace whispered, her voice overflowing with love. "I am your mother. I promise that you will always know how wanted you are, every single day for the rest of your life." 20 minutes later, William came into the private room. Elena had located him in the waiting area, where he was trying his best to keep his feelings hidden. But the moment his eyes fell on the baby, the composure he had maintained for 78 years simply fell apart. Grace smiled and offered the baby to him. "Would you like to hold your great-granddaughter?" she asked. As William gently took little Lily, his hands were trembling just a bit. In that one moment, a completely new family was created. This was a family founded on love and resilience, not on cruelty and manipulation. William held the tiny baby against his chest with unbelievable tenderness. This sleeping child, so small and new, felt lighter than his own leather briefcase. Tears started to roll down his cheeks, falling openly and without any shame. "You are the very picture of your father," he whispered to the baby, whose name was Lily. "You look so much like my Robert. I have been waiting for you for so very long time." He stood completely still for several minutes, just holding her. No one in the hospital room said a word, because some moments are too sacred to be broken by noise. Elena snapped what must have been 400 pictures, although she would later claim it was much less. Her phone's photo album, however, would tell a different story. Sebastian stood in the doorway, holding a stuffed elephant and pretending to be very interested in the ceiling panels. A short while later that morning, a news story appeared on every major media website in the city. The headline was short and clear. "Bennett heiress gives birth to a baby girl." The article featured just one photograph, which was provided by the family. The picture showed Grace in her hospital bed, cradling Lily, with William standing beside them, looking proud. Grace was glowing with absolute joy. Lily was sleeping soundly, and William was gazing down at them with a look that held 25 years of deep sorrow, which was now replaced by pure happiness. All of that profound loss had somehow been converted into the most wonderful kind of joy. Dylan was the first person to get the news alert on his phone. He was living by himself in a tiny studio apartment in the Bronx. For his dinner, he was eating instant noodles straight from the cooking pot because he did not own a single bowl. A news notification flashed on his screen and he clicked on it without really thinking. He then found himself staring at the picture for a very long time. He saw Grace, looking beautiful and surrounded by people who clearly loved her. He saw William, the grandfather Dylan never even realized he had, and he saw Lily, his own daughter. She had his dark hair, but she also had her mother's striking violet eyes. She was going to grow up in a penthouse with a view of Central Park. She would be treasured, she would be adored, and she would always know that she belonged. As he stared at that image, a powerful and sudden realization hit him like a tidal wave. He finally understood the true value of what he had thrown away. She was not just some waitress that he could easily forget about. She was a woman who would have offered him all the love in the universe if he had only been willing to accept it. He had lost a daughter who would have adored him if he had only made the choice to be a father. He could have belonged to a true family if he had simply tried to be a good man. He flipped his phone over, setting it face down on the bed. He just sat there in his quiet, bare apartment, completely alone. He had no more tears left to shed. He remained in the stillness, with only the silence as his companion. It was October 14th. It was the day that was supposed to be their 6th wedding anniversary. At that exact same time, Grace was standing 62 stories high above Manhattan on the balcony of the Bennett family home. She looked out as the sun went down over Central Park, which was a stunning canvas of red, gold, and orange leaves. The evening glow made the huge city look almost calm. Her 1-year-old daughter, Lily, was sitting comfortably on her hip. Lily was chattering away, making happy sounds that were starting to sound like real words. She had on a little white dress and tiny shoes that she constantly tried to kick off her feet. Her plump little fingers were fiddling with Grace's locket, a habit she had probably repeated 40 times that day. "That is Mommy's locket, my love," Grace said in a soft voice. Lily only held on to it more firmly and made a noise that was very close to GA. "That is a very compelling argument," Grace answered with a small laugh. From the living room, the evening news was playing on the television. The news anchor's voice could be heard through the open glass door. "In legal news this evening," the man reported, "disgraced attorney Dylan Crawford has been sentenced to 22 months in a federal prison." The reporter continued by reading the list of his crimes: fraud, embezzlement, and violations of securities laws. Dylan, who had once been a senior partner at a top-tier law firm, was now heading to a minimum security facility in Otisville, New York. Grace turned her head and looked inside at the television. A brief image of Dylan flashed across the screen. He was being escorted from a federal courthouse in a gray suit that looked much too large for his frame. A public defender was walking next to him. He appeared so thin and had aged so much. He looked like a total stranger. Grace only watched for 3 seconds. Then, she walked back into the room, took the remote control, and switched the television off. Her best friend, Elena, was sitting on the couch, eating Thai food right out of the box. She had her feet propped up on the coffee table, which was something Sebastian never would have allowed. "Are you doing okay?" Elena asked. "I am perfectly fine," Grace replied. "It is all over now." And it really was. The whole painful part of her life was finally finished. Every single issue from that awful, rainy night in October was now settled. Dylan's mother, Margaret Crawford, was found guilty of fraud for lying to the court. She was sentenced to 6 months of probation and 200 hours of community service. She now works in a soup kitchen in Newark, wearing a hairnet and serving food to the kind of people she used to look down on. A judge also issued a permanent restraining order. This order makes it illegal for her to ever try to contact Grace, Lily, or anyone else in the Bennett family. She now lives alone in a tiny 1-bedroom apartment in New Jersey. Every single night, she calls Dylan's old cell phone. She leaves messages on a voicemail that is no longer active. The messages are always the same. "Everything I did, Dylan, I did for you." But no one was around to hear it anymore. Dylan's mistress, Brittany Voss, was completely cut off by her wealthy father. It happened only 3 months after the scandal went public. Her connection to Dylan was harming the family's business reputation. Her father, Richard Voss, handled the situation with his typical, cold-hearted efficiency. He simply had the locks on her Miami condominium changed and canceled all of her credit cards. Brittany now resides in a shared apartment in South Beach. She supports herself by selling her high-end designer clothes and purses on Instagram. Her live-streamed sales events usually attract about 150 viewers. The majority of them are just there to watch the disaster unfold. On her page, she describes herself as a phoenix rising from the ashes. That story would be more believable if the ashes were not Gucci purses, and if the phoenix was not pleading with her followers to send her money for a cup of coffee. As for Dylan Crawford, he checked into a federal prison in January. It was a minimum security prison where he was sentenced to serve 22 months. If he behaved well, he could be out in just 14 months. But he would leave prison a broken man. His career as a lawyer was over. He had a criminal record, no money, and not a single powerful friend left. On top of that, the court ordered him to pay $10,000 a month in child support for the next 17 years. For the very first time in his life, his future was completely in his own hands. He had no wife to run his home, no mother to clean up his messes, and no mistress to boost his ego. He was just a man, utterly alone, forced to face every bad decision he had ever made. Grace hardly ever thought about him. When his name did cross her mind, she felt a sort of quiet, far-off sadness. It was like remembering a house you used to live in, a house that had later burned to the ground. You do not miss the house itself, but you remember the feeling of believing it was once a home. The Lily Bennett Foundation held its official launch on a very specific day. It would have been Grace and Dylan's 6th wedding anniversary. Grace chose that date on purpose and did not feel sorry about it. The foundation started with an impressive $50 million from the Bennett Family Trust. Its goal was to help women and children escape financial abuse from a partner. This is a terrible kind of control where money is used like a weapon. In just its first year, the foundation helped more than 12,000 women. It gave them money for safe housing, lawyer fees, classes on managing money, and job training. The foundation also teamed up with family courts in 6 different states. They provided lawyers for women who could not pay for one during a divorce. Its new hotline for support received 400 calls in the first week alone. The lovely townhouse on East 73rd Street also had a new purpose. This was the same house where Grace once cooked, cleaned, and painted a beautiful butterfly mural on the nursery wall. Now it was completely changed. It had become a safe, temporary home for mothers and their children fleeing abusive situations. The house had enough space to shelter 8 families at a time. Grace decided to save one special thing from the old house: the butterflies in the nursery. She hired experts to carefully restore the mural and protect it behind glass. The butterflies were a daily reminder that something beautiful had once existed in that house, long after everything else had become so ugly. One Tuesday evening in late October, Grace was at the annual gala for Time magazine. The magazine was honoring her as one of its Women of the Year. She wore a simple black dress and her platinum locket. There were no sparkling diamonds, no fancy tiara, and no flashy designer logos anywhere on her outfit. She looked like the perfect image of strength. She was a woman who had survived a terrible fire and used the ashes to build something beautiful. Down in the front row, Lily snuggled happily in the arms of her great-grandfather, William. Elena had helped pick out the tiny dress she was wearing. The baby was chewing on the ear of a stuffed elephant, a gift Sebastian had given her at the hospital. She had not let go of that toy for a single second. William held his great-granddaughter with a natural comfort he had developed over the past year. He had realized that the best moments of his life were not spent in a boardroom. They were happening right here, playing with blocks on his apartment floor with the 1-year-old girl who called him Pa. Elena sat next to William. She looked absolutely amazing in a new dress she bought with her own money. She was now the executive director of the Lily Bennett Foundation. Grace had offered her the job, and Elena had only one condition: that she could still eat her Thai takeout at her desk. A little further down the row sat Sebastian. He sat perfectly straight in his sharply pressed suit. He pretended to look at his phone, but his eyes were locked on the stage. If you knew him well, you could see the incredible pride shining on his face. Grace walked up to the podium. A crowd of 500 people filled the grand hall. The most powerful people in the city, from editors to executives, had their attention focused entirely on her. Grace gently tapped the microphone and scanned the crowd, her eyes finally landing on Lily. With her fingers spread wide, Lily gave a little wave with her tiny hand, the way babies often do to say hello. A warm, gentle laugh moved through the audience, and Grace returned it with a soft smile. Then she began her speech. "1 year ago," she said, "a man handed me a check for $10,000 and told me I should be grateful. He explained it was more than I was worth after 5 years of being his wife. On our wedding anniversary, the very same evening I was served with divorce papers, his mother arrived at our home. I was 7 months pregnant. I could only stand and watch as she shoved the clothes for my unborn baby into a garbage bag." A heavy silence fell over the entire room. "They worked hard to convince me that I was worthless," she continued. "I had no family, no money, and no influence. They told me I was an unimportant footnote in their very important story. For a very long time, I actually believed them. When you are told something again and again by the people you are supposed to trust, you start to believe it is true. That is the real way to control another human being. It is not done with fists, but with words. It is not about loud acts of aggression, but about the silent moments of neglect. It is the slow and steady chipping away of a person's belief in themselves." She paused, allowing her words to sink in. "My story turned out differently. I was one of the lucky ones. I discovered a family I never knew I had. I met a grandfather who had been looking for me for 25 years. I reconnected with a best friend who made one phone call that changed the course of my life. But that is not reality for most women in my situation. For them, there is no fortunate phone call. There is no billionaire grandfather waiting on a corner to save them. Most women step out into the pouring rain with a bag and a check, and there is nobody at all waiting for them." She looked across the silent room. "That is why we created this foundation. This was never just my story. It is for every woman who might be standing on a street corner tonight in the rain, holding her child and a suitcase, burdened by the terrible, crushing idea that her only value is what some cruel person has told her it is. This award is not for me. It is for every single woman who was told she was nothing, but somehow found the strength against all odds to believe she was everything." Grace looked down at Lily. Her daughter had stopped playing with her toy. She was reaching up with both her little arms toward the stage, making a small gurgling noise as she tried with all her might to say the word "mama." Grace stepped back from the podium as the entire room rose to its feet in applause. 500 people were standing, but the sound barely registered with Grace. She walked down the steps from the stage, gently lifted Lily from William's arms, and held her daughter tightly against her chest. William put a comforting hand on Grace's shoulder. His eyes were shining with tears, but he said nothing. His silence said everything. Elena was crying freely, making no effort to hide it, as dark streaks of mascara ran down her cheeks. She grabbed Grace's free hand and squeezed it so hard it would certainly leave a mark. Sebastian stood slightly apart from them, his hands clasped behind him. He stared at a point high above the crowd, his expression firm. If you had asked him if he was getting emotional, he would have insisted it was just dust in his eye. But no one asked. Everyone in their small circle knew what this moment meant, and they all respected the privacy of the man who had been so important in bringing them all here. They left the ballroom together, moving as one. There was Grace and Lily, William, Elena, and Sebastian. Just 1 year ago, these 5 people had been spread across the city, separated by time and circumstance. They were kept apart by legal documents, by deep personal loss, and by a system that had tragically failed an innocent child. But tonight, as they crossed the lobby of a Manhattan hotel, they looked exactly like what they were now, a family. Grace did not look back. She had wasted enough of her life looking over her shoulder, at past foster homes, at empty mailboxes that never held a letter, and at a marriage that was not the fairy tale she once believed. She was finished with looking backward. She was finished with being the woman she used to be, the one who accepted cruelty because she had never been shown kindness. The cool air of an October evening greeted them when they stepped outside. It was a perfect autumn night in New York. You could smell a mixture of fallen leaves and city traffic, all wrapped in the unique electric feeling of a city that is always awake. Lily buried her face in Grace's neck and let out a long, sleepy yawn. "I think someone is about ready for bed," Elena said quietly. Grace smiled and answered, "Well, somebody did have to sit through a very long speech." Elena then said, "And that somebody was absolutely amazing." Grace hugged Lily a little closer. She looked up at the sky, which was surprisingly clear, and saw a handful of stars faintly visible, pushing through the city's glow. They were dim, but they were there. Her mind drifted back to the night she had fled the townhouse. She could still feel that terrible night. The pouring rain made the sidewalk dangerously slick. She remembered the heavy suitcase, the precious locket, and the $10,000 in her hand. Then came the sound she would never forget, the front door shutting, locking her out for good. From inside the house that had just rejected her, she heard the unmistakable pop of a champagne bottle being opened in celebration. She thought of the 6-block walk through that violent storm to get to Elena's apartment. One hand protected her pregnant belly, and she felt a loneliness so deep she was sure no one else in the world had ever felt it. But she was mistaken. She had never truly been alone. She had a loyal friend who would make a frantic call in the middle of the night, acting purely on a bad feeling. She had a grandfather who spent a quarter of a century searching the world just to bring her home. And she had a daughter who right now was happily drooling on her great-grandmother's valuable locket. Most importantly, she had herself. Grace Miller, Grace Bennett, Grace Eleanor. Her parents had loved her so fiercely that they had her name carved into platinum before they were forced to give her up. She had once been a waitress. Now, she was an heiress. She was a mother. She was a woman who was told she was nothing, yet somehow found the strength to pull herself up from that cold, wet street. The car arrived, and William opened the door for them. Grace slid into the back seat, carefully holding Lily. Elena followed right behind, already on her phone, ordering Thai food to be delivered for their journey home. The car pulled away from the curb, becoming just another pair of lights in the flowing river of New York City traffic. Grace looked down at Lily, who was sound asleep on her chest, her tiny hand still wrapped tightly around the locket. "We are going home, my sweet girl," Grace whispered. And for the first time in her whole life, she knew that was completely true. Grace Bennett did not set out to destroy Dylan Crawford. She just stopped carrying his weight for him. The moment she let him go, he realized he did not know how to stand up by himself. Some men dedicate their lives to building great things. Dylan Crawford dedicated his life to tearing one down, and he was the very last person to realize that she was the foundation he had been standing on the entire time. If Grace's story moved you, I would be so thankful if you could do something for me. Please take a moment to press the like button. It helps our channel reach more people in ways you cannot imagine. And if you love stories about satisfying justice, fresh starts, and life-changing secrets, please subscribe and ring the notification bell so you will not miss what is coming next. Now, I am very curious to hear your opinion. Was Grace too merciful? Or did Dylan get exactly what he deserved? Please share your thoughts in the comment section below. Are you on Team Grace or Team Mercy? I promise to read every single one of your comments. And always remember this: be especially kind to the quiet people in your life. They might just be the ones who are secretly holding everything together. Thank you so much for watching today, and I am excited to see you again for our next story. Our team is passionate about every video we create. We research and write each one to share powerful stories that are both entertaining and uplifting. We truly believe that a great story can change a person's life, and we will always remain committed to making content that makes a positive impact. Thank you for being such a wonderful part of our community.